In 2018, at the world premiere for The Woman Who Fell to Earth, the first Doctor Who episode to feature Jodie Whittaker as the Doctor, Tosin Cole as Ryan, and Chris Chibnall as showrunner, Chris Chibnall said to the press regarding Ryan's dyspraxia that, "We did a lot of research into that with the Dyspraxia Foundation. The script team have been working with those guys. It was important because people live with these things. I have a nephew with dyspraxia. It's a relatively common thing among kids. So it's important to see that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. That's the most important thing about Doctor Who, and you're going to see that a lot this year." And Tosin Cole added, "It's important for people to know that anything is possible. You can overcome anything by just cracking on. That's my 2 pence on it." Today, we're going to have a discussion and deep dive into Ryan and his dyspraxia, looking at what dyspraxia is and how it gets represented in media, the fundamentals of representation in the first place, how Ryan's dyspraxia was handled on Doctor Who, different perspectives on that representation, and we will go and comb through all the clips I could find from Ryan's time on the show that relate to his dyspraxia, and we will have a big fruitful discussion on those. Who are we to discuss all this? I'm Neo from Australia, and I'm very happy to be joined by Moon and Nix from the UK. Why don't you two kick things off by introducing yourselves and sharing why you feel this is an important conversation to have?
I am Nix. I'm a Scottish trans man living in England. I have dyspraxia, obviously, and a bunch of interesting and interconnected conditions. I think I feel really strongly about representation, and I'm very interested in sort of critical analysis of representation, in part because as a trans person at the moment, the question of representation is a little bit relentless. So yeah, I think I'm quite interested to tie in some of my thoughts and feelings on representation as a topic, how it relates to sort of art and creative media and stories, and how all of that relates to sort of where we're at when the Chibnall era was starting and where we're at now.
Yeah.
I am Moon J. Cobweb, a butler and a writer.
This is probably giving a little bit away ahead of time, but it has been a bit of a journey going back over these issues relating to Ryan and sort of putting myself back in the mindset that I was in when I was sort of first watching this come out, and crashing that a million miles an hour into some of the things I feel now reflecting on the era.
I probably should have in any way cited my own neurodivergences, including relevantly dyspraxia.
How would you define it then for people who are unfamiliar with it or are only vaguely familiar with dyspraxia from the sort of coverage on Doctor Who?
It's a tricky question. So there's a definition in one of the very useful quotes that you linked us.
Yeah, there's a few things in these articles. I'm interested in hearing how they do or they don't, or they do to a degree, sync up with your actual lives and lived experiences. So from that Radio Times, How Doctor Who Tackles Dyspraxia in Series 11 article, that's the one that talks about, quotes at the screening of The Woman Who Fell to Earth, Chibnall's nephew, all that sort of thing. The definition it gives for dyspraxia is, dyspraxia, or developmental coordination disorder, is a lifelong condition affecting motor coordination, organization, perception, language, and thought, and is often described as a, quote, hidden condition, end quote, that few know much about. Although the exact causes are unknown, dyspraxia has been theorized to be caused by a disruption in messages between the brain and the body. And then it goes on a bit. Do you have any thoughts on the other things that article offers, like as a definition?
Then it goes on to sort of talk about the standard list. And I think we were reflecting, because we've read like the Wikipedia description and the Dyspraxia Foundation description, to just sort of touch base with the difference between how we talk about dyspraxia, because we're very interested in our own condition. I think we've bounced a lot of things back and forward between each other and other dyspraxic people that we're in a broader community with over the years. And it's interesting to look back and see sort of what the 2-sentence intended summary is. How it was put to me really helpfully by a neurodivergence mentor via my work was that you can sort of split the symptoms of dyspraxia into 3 major quadrants, sort of macro movements, micro movements and sequence processing. Macro movements is the big famous bit, the fact that I walk into doors, the fact that Ryan can't ride a bike, the fact that I knock pint glasses off of other people's tables all the time and have to explain that I'm not drunk, I've got a disability. Then there's also micro movements, which are the smaller fiddlier things. I have some actual physical problems speaking and had to have speech therapy when I was very small because I couldn't say some letters, and I still find speaking a bit hard sometimes. I also don't hold a pen like a reasonable human being at all, and was sort of ritually humiliated for this throughout most of school. And now I'm quite proud of it, but it does wreck my hands. And then the sequence processing is the bit that's probably referenced the least, but I think, and Min will probably come in on this in a second, is one of the bits I find the most salient and underlying and feel like it speaks to some of the internal experiences of dyspraxia. I'd say I don't have a normative relationship with sequence. My brain can take in very long sequences and put them back out again in just sort of any order. I find sequences being disrupted to be incredibly difficult. So I find it, say, for example, hard to accept help if cooking, because I don't see cooking as a series of small tasks that I'm putting in order. The only way I can do a task like cooking is to have this one big block thing that is, make an omelette, and that starts happening. And if someone was to come in and just move the chopping board, it's like, I have no idea what's going on now because this just isn't broken down in my brain. That's how I get around it. Another thing is maths. I'm quite good at maths, but I do maths in a completely unreasonable way. And have got in trouble my whole life for laying out my working in ways that just read as incoherent to most people. Yeah, Moon, anything you want to...
Yeah, so I would say the way I relate to my dyspraxia, and this isn't necessarily a position that comes from the mainstream of academic analysis on the condition, this comes from my own study of my own experiences, is that I think what connects all of those disparate manifestations, the macro, the micro, the sequence processing, is they're all ultimately related to memory, and not in the sense of amnesia, although I do have a complicated memory, I am known to forget things, but in the sense that remembering the order things going in, remembering things like muscle memory are harder for my brain to train itself to do than for most people. And I have found that framing it in these terms, other dyspraxic people who have never encountered this suggestion of sort of the causal order of the condition are like, yeah, that does actually make a lot of sense. But that is ultimately something that I have come to as a reflection on the condition. For me, it is not information you will find on Wikipedia or even the Dyspraxia Foundation page, so take that with a pinch of salt. I will say a model that has been useful for me understanding my own dyspraxia is sort of probabilistic. If there is an A-B binary in a situation, turn left or turn right, my brain doesn't quite accept that there is a 100% guaranteed correct answer to that. It's 99% of the time you should absolutely turn left when walking to the street down the garden path. But 1% of the time, for the sake of variety, you should turn right, even though it's the wrong way. And it's like that with every single tiny little thing in the world. There is a randomized chance that my brain will go, what you need to do is do the one you don't often do, because sometimes it's important to do the one you don't often do. And there are situations where that's very true, and situations where that's not. And my brain can't really tell the difference between those.
Yeah, if I can add a layer onto that's sort of a related framework that I think is very structural to how I understand what's going on in my brain, is an idea of having a problem with the formation of habit, like the mechanical and neurological formation of habit. And this was sort of filtered down to me by someone that works in kind of disability research. So it's a bit similarly fraught, but I'd be interested if, like the intense world theory of autism, this is something that sort of crops up again further down the line as it's a more fully fledged idea. But yeah, the idea is that experientially, most of the things I do, I'm doing for the first time. My body doesn't learn things and I am able to lean on the mental shortcuts that come with having done things before. And that actually carries across everything. And I find that that sort of explains the disparate issues from the fact that, like, I will walk into the doors in my own house, not even consistently at random, if I'm not paying attention to where they are. I don't just pick up my keys because that's the thing I need to do when I'm leaving the house. Like, nothing just happens. Every single thing is quite sort of focused and deliberate motion, and that requires a lot more executive function constantly, which is knackering. It means that there's a lot more things go to hell much more quickly. I can't rely on my brain or my body to just be able to do things that they've been able to do in the past. But it does come with the benefit, I think, that you do learn interesting things about the world and the things that you do, if every time you do them, you're doing it for slightly the first time. So yeah, that's sort of a big exploded diagram of dyspraxia. I think one of the reasons why we've both ended up sort of these little narratives and personal core central myths is that is something that's kind of missing from a lot of descriptions of dyspraxia that you get handed. You know, you get informed, like, congratulations, you can't ride a bike, you can't hold a pen, there's a word for that. And then you've sort of got to go about and live your life with this sense that there's this disparate world of things that you can't do for some reason. They've all got one name. And I think if you're quite a narrative person, there's a natural tendency to try and find something that pulls that together into a coherent experience, rather than just sort of being a big list.
Yeah, that's all super well said. That's really, really interesting. From there, do you want to start talking about representation more, or do you want to talk about any more baseline theory dyspraxia stuff or disability intersection stuff? Where would you guys like to head from there?
I suppose on the note of disability intersection stuff, it is probably worth flagging the dyspraxia is often comorbid with other conditions, particularly autism and ADHD, which are both much better represented in the cultural conversation, and I think have more that quality that Nix was just acknowledging, of there being a narrative around them. You don't just get told this is the condition and these are the symptoms. You sort of, particularly within the past decade and on the culture on the internet, you get a sense of the culture around it, of what it is like to relate to other people and what the world is like from this perspective. Because people have done that learning and done that sharing and generated memes, and the conversation is further forward. And I am autistic, which is not something I always recognise about myself because it presents a bit atypically, but I certainly am, and the Intense World actually is a model of understanding autism that helped me to be like, oh wait, I really relate to that. It just doesn't present to me in all of the ways that it's standardly described in culture.
Yeah, I think there's something interesting there. So we've referenced a few times the intense world theory of autism, which is one of many theories, and I'm not an expert in autism or any of these. So you know, with a pinch of salt, I think I would say I'm more talking to cultural narratives within disability communities that have been handed down to me. I've done a bit of my own research on these things, but often how I'm talking about them is in terms of sort of more local cultural narrative. And I say this a bit carefully because I know that things that are my actual academic specialist topic can end up really distorted in how people talk about them between friends. But yeah, with that noted, the intense world theory of autism is broadly this shifting away from looking at autism as a set of symptoms and more towards looking at it as, okay, an experiential condition where autistic people have very intense just sensory input. The autistic people are experiencing lights brighter and sounds louder. And also worth saying, I'm not sure if I have already, that I'm autistic. I had this sort of concept explained to me by a friend in part of my sort of journey to being diagnosed with autism, and was really struck by it as like, oh, this, I have always sort of identified with bits and pieces of descriptions of like what autism is, what the end product is. But what I've always been doing is weighing up the output of me, sort of the little ticker that comes out of the machine, with this list of like, well, these are the autism things. Am I is my output lining up with the autism things? If it's not, then I'm not autistic, and if it is, then I am, and that's how this works. And this is sort of the first time someone described it to me. I was like, oh God, I genuinely never thought about this in terms of how I experience the world. I was really thinking about this constantly in terms of how successful a facsimile of a normal person I am performing. But what you have said now gets sort of below the skin of that and confronts me with thinking about myself at all. And I think that's important, actually. I think that point will end up interrelating with some of the things I want to say about representation and Ryan and how his character is approached. But yeah, I think there are increasingly sort of community-built descriptive narratives of what it's like to be autistic and what it's like to have ADHD that people are bouncing around them within communities. And to my knowledge, that dyspraxia hasn't quite had that moment yet, at least at the same level, with the same level of interconnection. I think it's having a bit of a moment like that, or it has done in our direct friend community of neurodivergent people, where a lot of us are dyspraxic.
But yeah, it's still a ways from broaching the mainstream and really to glance in the direction of the meta topic here. Ryan as a character could be accused of taking us a little further in terms of sheer exposure to the abstract concept, but perhaps falling short in terms of that specific goal, that idea of, getting at the interiority.
How would you say representation of dyspraxia generally is then in the mainstream, both in fictional representations, but also maybe association with celebrities or well-known people or anything like that? How is it generally, do you think, over at least the past decade or so?
Thin on the ground, I would say, honestly. I mean, I'm very possibly missing things. I'm not necessarily the most in popular culture person. I could easily be overlooking some important landmark examples, and do feel free to cite any at me, because I'm genuinely curious.
We should talk about space dyslexia and Spock.
Yes, we absolutely should. At a personal level, prior to Ryan Sinclair, the most that I have felt in any way acknowledged by direct representation in some media that I've sat down and watched was the near example of the Star Trek Discovery Season 2 interpretation of the, at this stage, legacy character of Spock from Star Trek the original series, who is retconned in Star Trek Discovery to have a condition which is described as an explicitly alien Vulcan condition, but comparable to dyslexia, which is often comorbid with dyspraxia, and indeed which I have. But this is sort of a weird coded way of actually doing dyspraxia, because at no subsequent point is their condition ever really used in relation to their relation to writing, words, and language. It's basically, straightforwardly, quite a compellingly nuanced, not just off-the-shelf depiction of dyspraxia. A lot of the things I would have liked to see with Ryan as a character are got at with this version of Spock, and I quite liked it.
It's described as spatial and order dysphasia. Yeah, it's specific. I thought I would look up the specific receipt on this, because I don't think they initially describe it as like dyslexia in the show. I think they do eventually, but I think it's introduced with its Vulcan name, and it's a condition of like relationship to space and order or sequence processing. And I remember also just sort of latching onto that and being like, damn, that's not just talking about dyspraxia, that's getting at the bits that I have worn thin, like sort of repeating to people. It's like, oh, you might think that this is just about me being clumsy, but actually it's an interesting condition that affects all sorts of different, like, you've got straight to the heart of the interesting bits. Like, cool. And to be fair, similarly to dyslexia, there's a lot going on in dyslexia that isn't talked about in that kind of depth. But yeah, sorry, that is my little...
I'm just going to say that, like, I am certain that relatively quickly it is likened to dyslexia specifically, because I remember sort of finding that just a little disheartening, and then having a mixed experience with the degree to which it then went on. Like, it feels like, and this is wild speculation, but it feels like at some stage in the, drafting process, it was likened to dyslexia, and then someone said, you can't put that, no one knows what that is. No, likened to dyspraxia, rather. Aha, you see the thing where there's an AB binary, and I automatically reached for the wrong one.
I did meant to say earlier when we were describing that the phenomenon of other left, I think we've basically stopped using the word right in real life. It's just left and other left, because there's no point saying left or right, because the output is going to be so random that just say left, and if the direction they pick is wrong, say other left.
Yes, and that's probably that for specific personal experiences of something which is directly textually acknowledged to be dyspraxia or dyspraxia-like, that have felt like important representation to me at a personal level. But again, if there are any examples of dyspraxic characters in things that are relatively high profile that I just haven't seen at all, I'm very interested.
I was going to say, if anyone wants to recommend dyspraxic characters we might have missed in the YouTube comments, then throw them at us.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting how few relatively well-known characters in pop culture we can really come up with there. I'm aware of some celebrities with it. I've seen some press over that. I know Daniel Radcliffe has it because he talks about it occasionally. But it seems to be one of those things, even if people are open about having it, it doesn't get talked about that much anyway, which I think is interesting. I think it's lesser known and lesser talked about than maybe some comparable things we've been talking about. And so that's really interesting because it's not like something exceedingly rare or anything. So why is the discussion on it relatively slighter? I think that's curious.
Yeah, I mean, the stats are something ridiculously high. I was looking on the Dyspraxia Foundation page. It's something like 3% of the population or something, which, out of 100, 3 is a small number, but if in every 100 people, 3 of them are dyspraxic, that's a gratuitously high number. And yet, it's underrepresented in both media and cultural conversation.
Yeah, I don't know the methodology, and I guess therefore the veracity of it. But the Dyspraxia Foundation organization, their website says it affects around 5% of school-aged children. In their words,
this might interconnect with. Thank you. This might interconnect with things we will go on to talk about with regards to Ryan. But I think something that stood out to me from just reading the basic background materials is that there's really not a lot of focus on what adult dyspraxia looks like and what being a dyspraxic adult looks like in a way that's probably actually comparable to where we were at with, say, autism and ADHD not super long ago, really at all. I think there's been a big shift towards people getting adult diagnoses of autism and ADHD, and sort of that point about cultural narrative and self-narrative and community narrative have generated sort of ideas about what adults with these conditions are like. Whereas I think there was an amount of emphasis on children, the issues children have, the extent to which dyspraxia is sort of a repairable condition with early intervention. In sort of some of the first layer of resources about dyspraxia that did stand out, and it felt like it wasn't focusing on constructing a conversation about what adult dyspraxia looks like. And I think that might really interrelate with the ways in which people don't talk about it because, being clumsy is being clumsy. Being severely clumsy, having real sort of motor coordination issues can be something people feel very privately about, can feel quite embarrassed by. And a lot of the other aspects of it aren't necessarily known or understood. So I wonder how many people don't have sort of a joint up understanding of how different issues in their life interrelate.
Certainly I see in sort of, poppy little listicles or memes about ADHD, a lot of conditions that like a lot of symptoms and things that I relate to. But I don't have ADHD. I've checked, and I astonishingly, one of the few people I'm at all close to myself, don't have an attention disorder. I just don't. I have a level of attention span that has its limits, but is ultimately within what I would consider somewhere around the average. So those conditions that I relate to in those lists can't be ADHD necessarily. I mean, they can be, but they might also be dyspraxia. And there's a degree to which I feel like some of the space around some of the lesser-known symptoms is sort of eaten up by them possibly being in comorbid conditions. So people will go, oh, it must be the ADHD that's meaning that I'm forgetting things.
Yeah, I mean, I had this with my autism assessment, where they were like, oh, you already have ADHD and dyspraxia. It could be quite hard to qualify whether you have autism.
On the representation angle we're talking about, can we talk a little bit about, this is the sort of thing that will feel like beyond obvious for some people and beyond opaque for some other people. But can we talk a little bit about why it feels important or valuable to actually see yourself, to theoretically see yourself represented in these ways, like to see a character with dyspraxia as a major character on a big show, before getting into how that was actually depicted and how that was achieved and how it was done. Just hearing kind of in the headlines, there's going to be a major character with dyspraxia on Doctor Who. How did that make you two feel, or how would that make you feel if you heard it now, without getting into how it was done? Just kind of the baseline of there's going to be this sort of representation. Why is that important, or what would you guys say to that?
Honestly, and like there's a bunch of valid and valuable sort of politicizing on the issue to be done, but straight up, number one, feels good, you know? Like, there's a degree to which it matters because it's nice, because when I heard about this as a thing, it just made me happy and got me at a, like, oh, that makes me feel represented level that I think I've struggled necessarily to feel in a lot of other contexts, you know? Like, there's... life is intersectional. I am a number of things as a person, and some of those things I see a lot in media and some I don't, and I don't think I've ever had an experience that's made me feel like the sugar rush, oh, this is good stuff. That representation is often cited as, you know, having a quality of at times for people who feel underrepresented as much as hearing about Ryan. And that matters. Just that feeling and the knowledge that I shared that moment with so many other dyspraxic people who care enough about Doctor Who to have been paying attention, of like, oh, me in the thing. I get to be in the thing in some abstract sense. That's nice and good and right.
Yeah, that's very well put. And I think, yeah, speaks to something that is important to take a moment to do, which is like we were speaking to each other long distance after the airing of Woman That Fell to Earth. And I was on a long sort of far out pivot of not being very connected to Doctor Who or fandom at the time, but I was watching this coming out live and also binging the Capaldi era at a terrifying rate because I was the meteor was coming back round. So yeah, I was very excited about Doctor Who in general at that moment, and having this big wave of sort of reconnection to these ideas and the imagery. And we were so happy. Like, we were properly sugar rush enthused. And yeah, I think I struggle to frame beyond that, you know, this amount of this is important for any particular structural reasons. I think it is just that it does induce those feelings. Particularly taking note of like Doctor Who's role in British culture in particular, its mode as an ongoing cultural conversation that Britain is having with itself. The knowledge that this isn't just like, oh, dyspraxia has been mentioned on my nerd thing that I like. That's nice. I like it when it's my nerd thing that's on, and I like to hear the words that I am together. Wow. It's the looking at this and being like, no, this isn't just that. This is symbolically part of a cultural conversation that is wide. Like, very random people will see this. Small children will see this, and that's cool. Like that basic thing that Chibnall says that he wants to do, I think is achieved. And yeah, we'll go on to talk about things adjacent to that, other than that, extensions of that, but absolute baseline. It made me happy like I was a small child, and if I had been a small child watching, because I was a small child that couldn't ride a bike, and couldn't hold a pen, and couldn't run without tripping over myself, that couldn't tie my shoelaces, that couldn't do a lot of things other children could do, I think I would have had strong feelings watching this, and that's cool.
Yeah. So I think some of what we're talking about is there's a big affirmation element and acknowledgement element and validation element to seeing yourself represented in, you know, a major cultural force like Doctor Who, especially like Nick's is saying, if you're a child and you don't necessarily feel you understand certain things you are fully, or you certainly don't see them depicted often. So to see such a huge popular culture force do that is a really big thing. And that's something Doctor Who takes it upon itself to do a lot. You know, the Revive series especially is tried to get very direct a lot of the times. I think of the LGBT representation. Russell T Davies really started trying to embed into the show when he took it on board, and how that was carried through. Series 11 in particular, Chris Chibnall's run on the show, the press run in 2018 for Series 11, I remember I was really being messaged in these sorts of terms of there's going to be a lot of representation, and that's part of the big new juice of the show is, you know, the kind of new inclusivity we're embedding into everything. We, of course, had the fantastic thing of Jodie Whittaker being cast as the Doctor, first woman Doctor. That's a whole new burst of representation into the show. We had Matt Stevens talking up the LGBT rep that was apparently going to be in Series 11, so that sounded very exciting before the series started. All the companion sort of announcements, first South Asian companion in Mandip Gill's Yaz, Ryan, of course, having dyspraxia. This felt like a big explosion of inclusivity and representation in a really exciting way. I was really excited about it. I remember in 2018 hearing all these sorts of talks. And so that, we quoted at the top from the Radio Times some coverage of that The Woman Who Fell to Earth premiere for the press, where Chris Chibnall is talking about, you know, what he's doing, bringing dyspraxia into the show. I remember being really excited by all this. Were you guys much in tune with sort of the coverage or messaging around Series 11 before it started, or this sort of promotion of inclusivity and representation?
Probably not beyond the general discussion of Geordie. I will take a second to say you have reminded me on this topic of actually a very similar sugar rush moment with representation in Doctor Who, and that's being an actual child, and Captain Jack.
Yeah.
Being, oh my god. That I can really connect those two emotional moments. That's really nice. So thank you. But yeah, no, I was not plugged in enough to know about sort of the specific disability representation, and I'm kind of glad I wasn't, because I think I actually would have been a little bit more cynical coming into it, or at least would have had some of my like critical defenses up. I think the fact that I was watching this and had no critical defenses up whatsoever helped it get me at that level, because it's just like, oh, wow, okay. How about you, Min?
So, this might be the dyspraxia to some extent, but I'm not wholly certain. I can't strictly remember exactly how much I was engaged with the paratexts at the time, certainly less than I am now, although I wouldn't say that I was in a degree less involved, like, fan plugged in this to Doctor Who, but I was definitely more in it than you were at the time. I was drawing you back. Point being, I think I was maybe a degree more aware of the paratext and the messaging beginning than you were at the time. And I will note that I think in some ways the Chibnall era had some of the straightest run of positive, like, cultural goodwill towards an era of any phase in New Who. Like, Davies obviously was coming up against the general cynicism that everybody knows Doctor Who is crap and was cancelled on purpose. And then Moffat obviously has always been a bit of a contentious figure and was coming off the back of, the mighty RTD brought the show back and now he's leaving and it's definitely going to be worse now. Whereas Chibnall, honestly, it feels like the media and the press had all the goodwill in the world towards this, mediocre middle-aged white dude, who was, going to bring back sensible reason and RTD-ish grounded representation to the show that has gone off on one with Moffat. And, in some ways I even bought into that narrative and, appreciated certain aspects of early Chibnall in being a bit more grounded in some ways than some Moffatisms, and there's conversations to be had about how much that is a merit and how much it's not, and I will defend some things and not others. But I remember, that being sort of the narrative around it at the time, and me seeing the sense in some of that. I will actually also, as an aside, continuing to pat Davies on the back for representational stuff, say another a degree to which he is responsible for some of the moments of representation that have really landed with me. It's just the general class tone of RTD1, just seeing working classness in television and in particular in genre fiction is some of the most that I've felt like genuinely represented by media ever.
Yeah, I cannot not cry at Gridlock as a complicated working class lapsed Irish Catholic.
Yeah, I think that was really well put, Moon, about the kind of cultural goodwill that the era was riding, that it was riding into its own premiere very, very much. I think there was a lot of people were excited about this. People wanted it to be good. It felt like a very positive thing in the run up to it. I know I was excited myself. I want to circle back around to the Chibnall quotes from that premiere from The Woman Who Fell to Earth in Sheffield back in 2018. Before we start going through the actual sequence of the show and the actual depictions itself, just talking about how it was being outlined at the outset here. So this is before The Woman Who Fell to Earth came out on TV. This is from a press screening. And so he's identifying it to audiences as, like Chibnall says, we did a lot of research into that, Dyspraxia. With the Dyspraxia Foundation, the script team have been working with those guys. It was important because people live with these things. I have a nephew with dyspraxia. It's a relatively common thing among kids, so it's important to see that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. That's the most important thing about Doctor Who, and you're going to see that a lot this year. Let's unpack what he's saying a little bit there. So what do we think of how he's framing that, his motivations in saying that? What do you two think of all that stuff?
Honestly, I certainly think that it's incredibly sincere. I have often reflected, and this is, again, as we're maybe a little want to do, slightly jumping the gun and peering ahead, but I have often reflected on his comment that he has a young nephew with dyspraxia, because I do feel in some ways his depiction of the condition feels like a depiction rooted in someone watching a child with dyspraxia and stenciling that on to an adult without a lot of thought about the idea that maybe the condition evolves and changes over time, particularly for some people. And that's not to say they didn't do research with the Dyspraxia Foundation. I am certain that they did, and that's not to say that there aren't adults whose dyspraxia expresses like Ryan's, but it's always rung very true to me that this is something that Chibnall has a personal window on, that is primarily with a younger relative, and in some ways that Ryan, as a character, feels like he exists in an interesting no man's land with regards to his age.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of look at representation and sort of the different forms that it can take, I think we've sort of just had a very honest chat about representation in the sense of, the condition is listed, it's described, it's present, it's in the form that I think Chibnall is talking about doing representation in this quote. Like, 10 out of 10 dyspraxia is present. Thank you. As just discussed, I do have some big feelings about that. I think there's another kind of representation, though, or a different way of approaching it, that I'm probably more interested in getting out of just those initial sort of gut reactions about, oh, it's nice to see myself in the thing. which is demonstrating the creative and storytelling potential of diversity and representation. And I don't feel the interest in that quote. And I don't feel the interest in that carries into the character, into the writing, into how Ryan as a figurative entity relates to the stories that he's in and the stories that are constructed around him. So I think I think this quote sums up for me where I feel like it goes wrong. Not by failing to do the thing it's setting out to do. I should say goes wrong for me. But it's not that it fails to set out to do this thing it's setting out to do, blah, blah, blah. It's that the thing it's setting out to do actually feels quite narrow. It's both large and quite narrow.
This is maybe a bit harsh, but at times it can feel like Chris Chibnall, it's someone coming in from the outside with a shopping list of things to do for the right reasons, good things to do, but it's, it's the problem of the outside savior coming and generously helping the underrepresented people be included, rather than someone coming and writing a story from their own experience.
At the risk of leaping ahead and compressing a bunch of points, it's sort of that shot of the Doctor watching Ryan repeatedly fall off the bike. It's that distance and that observation of the thing from the outside, and not the integration of that thing into the story that already exists and the way that it already works. We'll sort of get back to this when we get to sort of that clip in the more focused bit of discussion. But I do find there to be something really tragic in this sort of by the boxes, we are having a dyspraxia in the story approach, and not an approach that recognizes how much there is that relates to sort of dyspraxic experiences of reality in baseline Doctor Who that is already there. A show about an oddball who is lost in space and time and can't quite drive their go anywhere and do everything machine.
There's three things you both kind of raised there that I wanted to say something to, because they're super interesting. One is that Chris Chibnall kind of coming into his era with this push of, we're going to change it this way, we're going to represent in this way. That outside kind of coming in approach is interesting, like you're talking about. I think where I think that was really important is Doctor Who can, or any big, cultural force like this, an institution like this, can get kind of stuck in its lanes. And I think, that's where people get these ideas of, if so-and-so are totally welcomed and invited into a thing, there just must not have been any good enough to come up yet. When, we talk about why was there no black writer of a Doctor Who episode until Mallory Blackman co-writing Rosa. It's, I think a fantastic thing about Chris Chibnall was that he kind of didn't just kind of take that, I welcome anyone, any writer can pitch a script and, the best ones will come to the surface. There wasn't this kind of pseudo meritocracy idea with him. There was a very specific, I'm going to go specifically out and specifically try and get certain voices into it, which sometimes leads us down kind of weird paths. I know on this channel, we've talked a lot about how Chris Chibnall came into the era saying, well, we got to do Rosa Parks and we got to do the partition and we've got to do so-and-so, before he had, writers for these stories or even specific ideas for these stories. They were just, there needs to be a Rosa episode, there needs to be a partition episode, which you can unpack in weird ways. But I think his intent was important, because I'm not saying the last two showrunners didn't want to achieve some of these things, but a lot of it wasn't getting achieved under him. So to kind of light a fire under the show and say, we're going to hire these sorts of people specifically, we're going to seek out and do these sorts of things specifically, we're going to specifically write in characters like this, we're going to have a companion like this, the Doctor's specifically going to be a woman. I think that sort of intent is one of the praisable things about Chibnall coming into the show. Of course, then we can unpack how was it actually executed, and that's where things get more knotty. But I think that kind of intent to bring into the show is something, at the outset, before we get granular, going into how it was actually done, that feels very positive, I think, at the start. The second thing that Nix was talking about that I find so interesting was saying it's kind of that framing of representations like the start of it. Okay, great, we've got a character with dyspraxia. Great, we've got a woman that's the doctor. Great, we've got so-and-so. Is that it? They just have that, and then we do stories. It's even the framing of we do stories like normal is a bit strange because, every character ideally has who they are brought into their stories. That's, the process of storytelling. So the idea that Ryan has dyspraxia and that's like it, rather than it being embedded into the show in a holistic way. I think some of those ideas we were playing around with there are really interesting, especially when we get into how his dyspraxia did factor into his character development in series 12 and whatnot, which is very interesting. And lastly, also Nix was raising this a lot earlier. This kind of, we were making that association with dyspraxia and a kind of child element to it. Like people can associate this in a childish way. Kids are just clumsy. That's what this is, without taking it seriously or even recognizing, what dyspraxia is specifically, and that it's an actual thing and everything. This kind of association with kids. Kids are going to be clumsy. Kids are going to struggle with so-and-so. I think that's so interesting because that factors into, like Moon mentioned as well, the weird kind of netherness of Ryan's age, that he's 19 years old. So much of his story is about riding a bike. So much of his story is about his granddad treating him in a very infantilizing way. Infantilization is one of the key things with Ryan's character on the show, and I think it's really interesting to actually connect that with his dyspraxia and talking about the nephew inspiration and everything. I think there's a lot of interconnectivity between the ideas we're playing around with there. Before we get into the granular discussion, the last thing I had in mind to look at was just some of the reception to Ryan's dyspraxia, unless you two have anything you want to say before I lead into that.
No, go right ahead, I think. Next, anything?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say in response to sort of that summary of points is a moment that has been discussed a bunch on Who Cares, where some of that alchemy, I think, is able to actually start working. Because I think I completely agree that Chibnall has done a very impressive and commendable thing in just raising the standard of what Doctor Who's production and content should demand and what it should be. But at times it sort of strikes me as he's putting a lot of just the bits on the table and not quite being able to complete the magic, or hoping that someone else can. I'm just going to pour some mercury, some salt, some sulfur. And I think a moment where some like that is able to be a platform that someone runs with and does not just representation, but like demonstrate the creative potential of representation in storytelling is some of what's going on in Demons of the Punjab.
Yeah.
It's worth noting that is something that did kind of require the sort of eyebrow raising. Chris Chibnall walks up to Doctor Who and says, "I'm going to do a story about the partition." You're like, "Oh God, really?" And it's like, "Oh, okay, no, well done. That you've actually allowed a bit of alchemy to happen here." But yeah.
Well, off the back of that, I will actually say that did remind me of some thoughts I was having during the second point. You can understand, I don't necessarily agree with, but you can understand the Chris Chibnall approach with regards to writing the first female Doctor to really never, at any point, make the show about the fact that the Doctor has regenerated into a female body and begun identifying coextensively as a woman. And that has its drawbacks, but I really do get, and I think everyone gets, why the net decision was like, you know what, let's just play this really subtle, not make a whole thing of it, and maybe if someone pitches a story that really is coming from a place of making a thing of it, then we lean in with that, and no one did, and so they never did, and it was never a big deal. It was just something that incidentally happened, and the Doctor just sort of, oh, this is a thing about me now. And gets on with being the Doctor. It's not necessarily the right call, who knows, but it's a call and I get it. And I think it's fairly easy to understand. And I think a problem is that mindset with regards to not making a whole big deal out of the representation sort of tracks out into the other representation, the disability representation, the race representation, the queer representation is a really complicated one on this front, because it's hard to say that it was particularly intentional up to a point, but But yeah, I think that let's not make this too much the focus approach really makes sense in the context of the Doctor. Whether it was the right move or not, it makes sense, and I think it makes less and less sense with the other issues, but it ends up just being this encompassing approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think to tag on the end of that, a broad point, because I think this is an idea I might come back to in its sort of direct relevance to some of the clips, is it's great to see Dyspraxia on Doctor Who. It is sort of heartbreaking to me as a weird guy. There's a lot of different versions of this podcast that we could do where I focus on different sort of words that are attached to ways in which I'm weird, but at the end of the day, I'm a weird guy. I'm a weird little guy. And Doctor Who is about a weird little person in a weird little universe. And there's something really tragic to me about this, like, a dyspraxic character, someone whose weirdness is compartmentalized and is comprehended and is specific, and is made discreet relative to the ways in which I relate to the Doctor and the TARDIS and what they do as an extension of things that are weird about me. Like, there's something there where that's the real life specificity of the lived disability experience could be seen to narratively cross paths with the hyper sigil of the weird, alternative, the revolutionary nonsense. And it's really sad to see that not be allowed to spark and interconnect, that not be the kind of story that's told here, that we don't see Ryan get on board the TARDIS and learn things about himself that come from being allowed to exist in an environment and reality that is a bit different in the same ways that he's a bit different. And like, you don't need to do a big trite thing about that. But I think there's just something in there that I feel like wasn't grabbed at. There's something in the Doctor not relating to Ryan and Ryan not relating to the Doctor, and them not having like a story about the interconnection of their experiences at different levels and styles of symbolism, that I think is a missed opportunity to demonstrate like the creative power of representation.
I definitely have things to say to that, but I think I will save them to say bouncing off of some of the reference material, because I think that will all come quite naturally,
Yeah.
So the last thing I want to talk about before we start actually working through the 26 or so clips relating to Ryan's dyspraxia across the show is an article from the 8th of October 2018, so the day after The Woman Who Fell to Earth premiered, on BBC News, titled Doctor Who, How the Dyspraxic Assistant Became My Hero. And I think this one is really useful to look at because despite BBC News and BBC Studios obviously being different things, I think it gives you an idea the kind of aspirational response the show was probably going for with Ryan, and seeing how the BBC's framing the reception to Ryan and Ryan himself, I think, is useful as we go and we respond ourselves to his depiction on the show. So this article starts with, ever since the 2005 series reboot, I've been hooked on Who, so I was surprised to find my highlight of the opening episode of the new series was nothing to do with the latest Doctor's debut, but involved a relatively minor character falling off a bike. More than 20 years ago, I was diagnosed with dyspraxia, and Sunday night was the first time I have ever come across a fictional character portraying my disability. This episode has received broadly positive reviews, most focusing on the spectacular performance of the first female Doctor, Jodie Whittaker. But for me, it acquired real resonance when Tosin Cole was introduced as Ryan, a young man with dyspraxia. Then the article goes on for a while talking about what dyspraxia is, what Ryan was doing on the show, and then it starts pulling different tweets. One of the tweets it pulls says, embarrassingly, I've started crying when I read in an article that the new Doctor Who companion also can't ride a bike. When you're a child with undiagnosed dyspraxia, that can make you think there's something inherently faulty about you, so this is a big deal for me. The article goes on to say, don't call him inspirational. Dyspraxia doesn't have an overnight fix. You can't will yourself to not be disabled anymore. It's always there, always present, always making things harder than they should be. I don't want to see people using the word inspirational to describe Ryan. He's not an inspiration. He's a normal guy who happens to have a disability. Then it pulls another tweet out by someone else saying, I loved how they showed Ryan's dyspraxia as something he lives with, not an inspiring story of overcoming disability. As the article goes on, it pulls another tweet saying, oh my God, a character on Doctor Who has dyspraxia. Fictional characters never have that. I feel seen. Talks more about the figures with how many people have dyspraxia in the UK. Talks about a few other fictional characters it can think of with dyslexia. Not dyspraxia, it's talking about dyslexia there, making comparison to them as cousins. Then it pulls another tweet saying, I have dyspraxia. I was diagnosed with it pretty early and went through all my schools with teachers not understanding it or claiming that dyspraxia wasn't actually a disability. Pretty amazing to see it portrayed in Doctor Who. And it ends with, I've waited more than 20 years for this. All I can say is it's about time. What do we think of all that BBC coverage?
So I'm going to go ahead and say that for all, I'm no doubt going to be quite critical in the discussion of the upcoming clips. Yeah, I relate to basically all of that, particularly as an initial response to the woman who fell to Earth, which, yeah, as we noted earlier, gave me some big feels, you know, like, it was a real moment. It felt genuinely important and touching, and I was, you know, relieved, for instance, when Ryan fell off the bike in the closing shot of the episode. That really mattered to and continues to matter to me as a moment of Chris Chibnall not dropping the ball, not simplifying things down to an inspirational, you know, you can fix it if you try hard enough narrative. And I vibe a lot with people, particularly at the time, all cheering and saying, yes, finally, this is how I feel. And I really, obviously, it would be fascinating to know how all of those various people who tweeted and the person who wrote that article feel about the general arc of the representation. It's easy to see the early stuff and not necessarily have the additional data of how the overall play out affected ongoing reception, apart from, you know, viewing figures, which certainly treaded down. But yeah, no criticism at all of that article for just cheering.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad that it was one of the things that I read sort of in preparation for this conversation, because I think it did help me get back in touch with some of those feelings. And it was also just a reminder of, like, okay, no, for doing what he... there's worse realities, right? Like, I'm going to go on to raise some criticisms of what actually happened, but taking a moment for, yeah, he falls off the bike, and he always falls off the bike, and thank you, that was the correct thing to do about that, particularly in the course of the woman that fell to Earth. Like, I do remember having sort of bated breath for that sort of last bit with the bike at the end, and I was like, come on, don't do this to me. It took me a very long time to learn, so I can ride a bike. It took a while. I was also in my late teens when I was learning, and I have quite a sort of like for like memory of going down a small path over and over and over again, and just being like, why doesn't this work? And like, yeah, that stuff, like, good, sure.
Yeah. So I think we're ready then to get granular with all this and start looking specifically through all these clips I've found. Well, all these clips I've selected out. I found everything I could. If you two or any commenters think there are some clips I missed out, please let me know. I'd be super interested to hear. But I could find 26 that related to Ryan or his dyspraxia, sometimes in a tangential way, but usually pretty directly. So the first two, that's two together. It's Ryan on the hill riding the bike, and then it's Graham going, oh, we're going to leave you and we're going to go on the train. So let's watch those, then talk about those.
Where do I start? Okay, yeah. I've mentioned this on here before. I'm pretty much not an idiot. I'm actually a capable guy considering. But I'm 19, and because of the thing I told you before, I can't yet ride a bike.
Who says you can't?
Me, Nan. We keep trying this.
And we'll go on trying till it's done. Now, keep your eye on Grandad.
You mean Graham?
Keep your eye on Graham then. 3, 2, 1, go! Go on!
Go on, Ryan! You're doing it, mate!
Nearly.
No, not nearly. I'm sick of coming up here. I'm sick of falling. And I'm sick of this stupid bike.
Ryan Sinclair, don't you dare!
Mate, you rode it for a second.
Can you stop calling me mate? Anyway, a second's not enough.
You'll do it if you keep on trying.
I just want to make you proud.
You make me proud every day.
Anyway, you're on your own getting that bike, because our train leaves in 20 minutes.
So what do we think of that? Ryan's introduction in the show, the bike riding, everything there.
So I have some really strong feelings about some of the framing in this series of clips. One of the things that I think I go on to find is kind of missing, even though it's more present at the start, but I think it goes missing over time, is sort of Ryan's internality of experience as a disabled person. And I went into sort of watching the clip with that in mind. And something that really stands out is one that we start with this framing device. We start the whole era with this framing device of a video of Ryan's face that he is making for the process of sharing his experience, sort of self-reflection to an audience. It says, hey, it's like, welcome to Ryan, welcome to Ryan's reality. And it opens with him talking like really relatably and frankly about one of the sort of trickiest emotional things about having dyspraxia, about there being a real disparity between your capabilities in different contexts and different things. And then we cut to the example with the bike. And something that really stood out to me looking at sort of the clip in parallel with the script is that something that actually goes missing in between at least the published script and this edited version of the scene is in the original script there is meant to be a moment after Ryan's chucked the bike off the side of the cliff. The first emotional framing of processing that moment is actually meant to be a picture of Ryan's face. I think there's a note that he looks
Instantly regretful. Yeah.
Immediately regretful, instantly regretful. That's it. And we get sort of what we get is his hand gestures. There is sort of that shot, but it really stands out to me that it's not that goes missing. We don't get a close up of Ryan's face. We don't get him processing this sort of emotional lapse, this overwhelm, everything that's going on here. We do get Grace and Graham's faces. We cut back from Ryan's hand grasping at the cliff. And then we get these other two characters' faces. And I think something about that just so neatly encapsulates what immediately goes wrong here for me. We've moved outside of Ryan. And I think this links all the way back to what Chibnall's talking about, his nephew, and sort of what Moon raises the idea that he's constructing Ryan by watching his nephew from the outside, and the idea of representation via sort of tick box list. I think what's missing here is this immediately sort of pulls back from being Ryan's story about himself, pulls away from being his self-reflection. Like, you could compare this even to the opening montage, introducing Rose in Rose, where we see her whole little morning. Like, this starts like it's going to do that, and then it just very subtly immediately steps away from being actually Ryan's perspective. Anyway, I have much too granular feelings about these scenes.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I very much agree. I certainly wouldn't be alone in the general sentiment for its flaws. I sure wish we had gotten the era that feels like it starts with One Who Fell to Earth, like, it's not perfect, and you highlight some of the issues, some of the seeds that will grow into being the issues right there. But this is by far, even here, the most in focus Ryan ever is as a character, and yeah, it does just sort of slip through your fingers as the episode progresses, such that it's already begun to wilt on the vine by the time that the framing device comes back at the end, ultimately not to tell us more about Ryan, but as a complicated gotcha moment where it's about Grace.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that I dislike the framing device moment at the end, but it does feel like that one thing that was the most his interiority ever is still being clawed away from him.
I think it was really interesting for Nix to bring in the script there as well. I'm looking, there's also a point when Ryan falls, the script has it as bang, crash, smash. Ryan falls, collapses amidst the bike. Wide shot. Graham and Grace run to Ryan from opposite directions. Ryan's POV up from the ground as Grace comes into view. We also didn't get that POV shot. It's shot differently in the actual episode. So I'm not begrudging a director not doing exactly what's in the script, of course not. But it is interesting, like Nick's pointed out, the script seems a little more keyed into Ryan's internality in the sense that at least it's kind of framing on him a little bit more. So it's interesting. The actual scene didn't come out quite that way in how it was directed.
Yeah, it's just little bits of drift over time. That sense that Chris Chibnall, when he sat down at his typewriter to write this story, had a fresh sense of Ryan and an investment in Ryan that just, by the time it's got to production, he hasn't managed to impart on the director enough that those remain shots that stay in, or maybe they were shot and they were edited out, it's hard to say.
Just the red bicycle. I think that's an interesting way to start. I don't think the era is not self-aware about it, because that start of Ryan talking to the camera, he talks about, I'm 19 and I still can't ride a bike. It's like the era is aware of like the tension there. I'm this old and I can't do this thing, which is traditionally more associated with children learning to ride a bike. But I still feel it frames Ryan in this way that if there were no other issues with this in the era, maybe it wouldn't be noticeable. But I think infantalisation is a really long-running issue with Ryan, and to an extent with Yaz as well. And so starting with the bicycle and, learning to ride a bicycle and his granddad's resenting him for not riding it right, or is he supporting him and all this kind of stuff. It's just an interesting kind of declaration to make at the start.
Yeah, I mean, this is cheesy as hell, and you don't need to do it like 2005 scene montage to introduce your protagonist, or actually, as we didn't quite take a second over in that BBC article, a relatively minor character falling off a bike, which is accidentally really biting. But like, you could have, and like the bike scene is really nicely filmed. A lot in The Woman That Fell to Earth looks really good, but God, you could interpolate that with cycle to Grandad. Oh, do you mean Graham? Like Graham doing his thumbs up on the hill. Interpolate that with like 5 seconds of Ryan at the pub with his mates, Ryan at work, Ryan just being an adult, and sort of cutting back to no one. These are his family, and this is the stupid red bike reality that he feels trapped in, and that would help contextualize why he chucks the bike off a cliff, because it's like, look, this is someone who is at the brink of being a grown man, who is a grown man. Like, he's had enough of this. He's not throwing his bike off the cliff because he can't ride the bike because he's 12. He's throwing the bike off the cliff because he's 19 things he'd rather be doing, because he's 19 years old. And actually, to some extent, the people in his life are not able to get on board with this as just a limitation on him. They're not able to focus their time and relationship sort of with him around things that they can share doing positively. It's this. He's stuck at this forever. And like, I don't think that is as much of a given as the script treats it as. I think that's actually quite weird.
That's So interesting. We actually see Graham's friends in the episode as well when he goes around and he's looking for, has anyone heard the word on the street about strange things in Sheffield? So we see some of Graham's friends of his age. And then I think of Ryan, his relationship with Graham. In the Series 11 finale, it's partially resolved through a fist bump. And, in the penultimate episode, he's finally called me granddad. It's like a lot of this stuff almost feels like it was written for a 9-year-old version of the character rather than a 19-year-old version of the character. So you pointing out, we don't see Ryan in a social setting, with other adults or people his age. That's really interesting to think about. He's so framed through the eyes of Graham. And this is an issue in other episodes of this era. There's a lot that's framed through Graham's eyes where maybe that wasn't the most interesting choice. But yeah, I think that's really interesting to look at Ryan's character that way.
Yeah, 3 seconds of him, sinking a pint and playing a computer game in clearly his mate's flat, But actually, it feels kind of weird to imagine watching Ryan drink a beer in this scene.
Yeah.
Even though he's 19. And that,
Yeah, and I think you highlight a very real thing, which is that culminating moment of him throwing the bike is very over the top, slightly hyper real, driving the point home bit, and also obviously setting up the mechanics of the chain of events that leads to the whole episode, so strictly necessary. But it had the opportunity to feel like the frustration of a grown man with the kind of grounding context of seeing him be a grown man that you hypothesize could easily have been included. Or the opportunity to feel overwrittenly a bit childish, and it ends up landing in, it could very much have gone either way, and it's just a little bit frustrating. In the end, the decisions made stack up to make it feel part of that process of infantilization.
If we're ready, we talked about the direction of the episode. The next clip we have is actually from the audio commentary with the director, Jamie Childs, and the lead actor, Jodie Whittaker, and it's about Ryan and his dyspraxia. So let's watch that one.
So the responsible grandparents that they are, bring your dyspraxic child to sit on the edge of a cliff to have a conversation. There's always
getting that bike, because our train leaves in 20 minutes.
It does look amazing, the weather, actually.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I mean, it's excellent grade actually done on this as well. It's really beautiful. There he goes, sent down the mountain to collect his bike on his own. Dyspraxic grandkid.
Your dyspraxic child, and it's it's particularly funny because it's a commentary, and you are looking at an adult.
Yeah,
he's in front of you, right? Tosin Cole is again. We keep saying a grown man. I don't know why I've landed on that as the sort of shorthand for an adult here for something like that. That's an adult, my friend. And he's not playing a 14-year-old.
He's playing a legal adult.
He's not playing a 10-year-old. He's playing a 19-year-old. We don't actually know if Ryan has a driving license, but he could. Yeah, I will say I do like... So this will come up again, but Tosin does put a lot of thought into his physical performance. And rewatching this clip, I do like the way that he sort of walks and jumps around the mountain. He does sort of move consciously like someone that's aware that they're a bit clumsy, particularly that little jump down at the end it's a bit awkward with the hands slightly out. I'm like, okay, no, I see myself in that gesture. That's that's the going slightly downhill of someone that knows that can go wrong. So I appreciate that.
He does. It's sort of understandable, but Tosin Cole gets singled out for by far the least praise in terms of performance of the core cast of the show in this era, because obviously Jodie's going to get a load because she's the Doctor and she's the first female Doctor, so it's very important that there's a lot of saying she's really great, and she is. There's a lot to break down there, but I'm not going to say that she's not a great actor or that she doesn't bring some really great things to the part. Obviously Mandip decides to deal with the paucity of her material by just going hell for leather. I am going to get a career out of having been a Doctor Who companion. Just you watch me. And obviously Bradley Walsh is a seasoned old veteran who is able to make Chris Chibnall's writing charming and naturalistic. It's really astonishing. Whereas Tosin Cole's in the complicated position of playing this underwritten character who slides out of focus and then just sort of hovers in the background, and I think in a lot of ways, he does ultimately clock this earlier than anyone else, that, his character has been let down by the entire developmental process of the show, and he's not going to come out of this with a career guaranteed, and no amount of trying his hardest can make him an icon in all of this, and he gives a bit of a disinvested performance in some ways as he goes. But I also actually do think that he is a really good actor who does as much as he possibly can, particularly early on, where maybe his heart's still in it a bit more.
Let's watch the next clip. It's a short one. It's the Doctor learning about Ryan's dyspraxia.
There's my bike.
Why is it in a tree?
We were up top and I chopped it over.
He gets cross because he can't ride it.
We're giving him lessons. He's got dyspraxia. It's a coordination disorder.
Anyway, enough about me.
This is kind of the first time they've done so something they will return to, the show will return to, is explaining Ryan's disability, and I don't hate that. I do think in a production that was slightly more interested in sort of playing with and having fun with the representation here, this would be the start of a chain of explanations of Ryan's dyspraxia that deliberately, maybe comedically, highlight how relentless explaining having a quite broad-ranging but not very well understood disability can be. I think my redemptive reading of this moment is seeing some of the exhaustion in Ryan as this little bit goes, and seeing the sort of parentalism in his nan and Graham sort of representing a little bubble that they're in that is quite hyper-focused on this issue. But leaving that aside, as a beat, I don't love it. I don't. If we were going to do something with Graham's ableism and his complicated discomfort with Ryan's dyspraxia and the way that intersects with their awkward relationship, I think this would be a grand beat in that plot thread. Because that plot thread doesn't really happen, I don't love it.
Yeah, no, pretty much. I mean, it would be a great moment to have, the first inkling of the Doctor finding out about Ryan's dyspraxia and talking to him about it in any way. But notably, the clip stops, as very much the engagement with the issue does, just shy of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a world in, so this is sort of linking back to my point about the Doctor and Ryan's relationship. I feel like there's a lot the Doctor could say to being told that someone has a coordination disorder. Even if it's as cheap as, I think I've got one of those somewhere. It's that's trash. Don't listen to these are not real script suggestions, they're all trash. But, that's the start of a mood board that could become an idea, that could become doing something slightly more characterful with this beat.
The next two clips are in the warehouse. They're a doozy.
Oh, yes.
But why here? Why tonight?
Actually, that might have been me.
Why? What did you do?
When I went to get my bag, there were this line in the air, and then it moved, and there were shapes.
And?
And I touched one.
Ryan?
You'd all would have done the same. I wouldn't.
I would have.
All right, the shapes disappeared. A few seconds later, that appeared. What have I done?
Hard to say, really.
I suppose you'll be blaming this on the dyspraxia as well. Can't ride a bike, started an alien invasion.
Graham?
What?
Enough, love.
All right, I made a mistake. But why did that guy move this thing from the peaks to here? And how did he even know it was there?
Good questions.
It's not your fault, all this.
Yeah, it basically is.
You couldn't have known that was going to happen.
Maybe tell Graham that.
He knows, really.
Oh, so there's a lot critical to say, but I'm gonna lead by saying in some ways, I don't completely hate this. I actually really like Tosin's delivery. I really like Jodie's deliveries. I think Bradley Walsh has the weakest dialogue here and manages to really sell it in itself. And a lot of what's wrong with this scene is ultimately the fact that it's an island, rather than this being, like, a completely irredeemable thing to have included.
Yeah, like, I've had this conversation with family and loved ones in my life. This is a thing people say to you when they're upset and fed up with the repetitive difficulties that come with being around someone that has a disability that can break and ruin things and involves a lot of getting things wrong and not seeming to be able to learn. Doesn't make it okay. It's really not okay. It's very hurtful. But I don't at all have a problem with that being part of the like representation that we're doing. Like, that is an interesting beat. Like, nor do I think it needs to be a very special episode at any point where Graham, like, very specifically learns the error of his ways in having said this. It's how stranded it is. It's well, one, actually, no, meta. It's the broader issue of Ryan existing via Graham. This is more room being given again for the ways in which, like, Graham reflecting on Ryan is the mirror through which Ryan primarily exists. And I think that's ultimately not great. But leaving that aside, it's the fact that this doesn't go anywhere, really. And I can similarly completely, like, really here for the believability of Yaz doing a whole "oh, he loves you" really bit, particularly, like, she's a young cop. Like, a lot of her day job is, like, low-grade interpersonal conflict de-escalation. That's what we see her doing earlier in this episode. And I think that's what she's trying to do here, and I've got time for it being, honestly, a bit emotionally short-sighted and not really the right thing to say from the perspective of achieving actual interpersonal justice. It's just hopefully the thing to say to get everyone speaking to each other enough to go away and do something else. And I sort of like that as a critique of Yaz and of general police work. That's an interesting beat as well. Also doesn't go anywhere. All of it feels a bit, this is just a jumble, you know? This is all of the narrative quality street that the future didn't want for some reason is here, gathering conceptual dust. And it's really weird to sort of to get at it as a moment in time, because it's like watching this happen live, it was uncomfortable, but I was interested. Watching it with the full sense of the narrative that's to come, I'm just confused by it.
Yeah, it just doesn't line up with the reality that we later get. And I've got a bit of a one to go on, a bit of a soapbox about Graham and Ryan's relationship that this might be a reasonable moment for, and I will bring it to the point of the clip toward the conclusion, which is, like, when you actually look at this relationship, it's really ultimately sort of an unhealthy one that is valorized by the narrative, because Ryan is a young lad who has already lost his mum. He's estranged from his dad. All he's really got left in the world in terms of family is his nan, who we will lose in the climax of this story. And her second husband, a sort of exhausting boomer, who he doesn't relate to or get along with very well, who has come into his life through the context of his nan deciding to date and remarry someone she met as a terminal cancer patient. This is someone he met first and foremost in the context that this man is at some point, probably in the near future, going to die of cancer. Then his nan dies, and this is the only person who he has left in the world. And he doesn't really like the guy very much. He's quite clear about that. And that's a valid personal boundary he's allowed to have as a human being. But this man is scared of death, and doesn't seem to have much else in his life apart from this late life relationship that he's clasped onto, understandably, because Grace is great and she seems to fancy him for some reason. And now she's gone, and all he's got is this teenager and the abstract sense that he should have a family. And so he's just constantly needling this young man who he doesn't have much in common with. He doesn't really like him for understandable reasons. He's quite ableist towards the kid, for instance. But just sort of subtly guilting him into recontextualizing him as family and letting down those boundaries and defenses against bonding with someone who's going to die of cancer quite soon, when Ryan is already incredibly traumatized by personal loss. And that's really interesting. That is the bedrock of a good drama, if anyone were interested in writing it. But yeah, I mean, this, to bring it back to this scene, it's no great leap to make the observation that Graham is a bit of an authorial self-insert. Chibnall has subsequently spoken about his own experiences as a cancer survivor, and this is his avatar in the narrative. Maybe slightly past his prime, but nonetheless not completely out of it. Middle-aged white man who's got all of this, worldly wisdom, is a little bit, Chris Chibnall writing himself into the story. Fair enough, you're allowed to do that. And I do think that this moment of having him go off the chain and be genuinely unreasonable at Ryan is a moment of Chris Chibnall being remotely self-critical, remotely honest, and be like, yeah, sometimes I've lost my temper with my dyspraxic nephew or whatever. Sometimes I'm not all wise insights into the world that I've gleaned with my many years. But then having done that confession, this scene where he allows his little avatar character to have a flaw and to have a flawed moment and to fail, he then completely forgets to continue to include that kind of self-criticism ongoingly, or suggest that rewards for that character come from personal growth, that come from examining those issues and working past them, and just instead, by and large, lavishes rewards on Graham as a character.
This is Graham's twin dilemma. Yeah, I mean, to build off the back of that, I think this is a moment that connects to a wider chain that goes way beyond Ryan and affects the Chibnall era as a whole, which is a kind of, I'm going to pull the word dysphasia out from earlier because I like the word dysphasia, but there's a sort of tonal dysphasia where Chibnall is someone who does write people-focused dramas, writes dramas for adults about people not being very nice to each other, and has a concept of Doctor Who, Pillar of Hope, and is sort of grinding those gears together like someone making Barbie's scissor. It's just sort of saying what is intended to have happened in a scene or an arc, and it doesn't always line up with sort of even where it feels like the characters inside it could go or how they're relating to each other in a given scene. Things will get set up that it's like, oh, you could spin a lot of character drama out of this. You've set up characters and drama, but having character drama is for some reason not part of your vision of Doctor Who. So you sort of determined to not do that, and in the course of not doing that, you managed to generate an uncanny valley of deeply liminal character nothingness. That's really hard to put a finger on and criticize in any particular direction because it's just not really there, even though it is. It's probably a degree more damning than I intended it to be when I started. But
the interesting thing with these two clips here is I think people remember the Blame It on the Dyspraxia clip a lot. But I think some people forget in the episode that, we get Yaz pretty much right after saying, come on. He knows it's not your fault. It's, don't be so hard on the guy, like right afterwards, which I think is so... I liked Nix's idea of it as being like kindling for, interesting drama with Yaz and whatnot. But I think it's very indicative of it's such a strange little scene because the era is so like pro-Graham and it's so invested. Ryan should be liking Graham and they should be, coming together as they do in the finale. It's like we have the weirdly barbed ableism of Graham there, and then it's like the show kind of apologizes for it through Yaz like right away, and then we just move on as if it wasn't that bad. Through the rest of the era, it's very unpleasant.
Yeah, that's the bit that I really struggle with. That's the like the moment with Graham, yes. The moment with Yaz after says something about how the story is asking you to read it that I don't like.
If we're talking of intent, the next clip is useful because that's again from the commentary from the director and from the lead actor. So let's listen to that.
Hard to say, really.
I suppose you'll be blaming this on the dyspraxia as well. Can't ride a bike, started an alien invasion.
I love that. I always remember that from my first read of the script. That line just stuck out to me. It just thought it's brilliant.
Great, isn't it?
Yeah.
Chris isn't here because he's ill.
So I don't understand.
Yeah.
I don't get it. I'm not sorry. I can understand not responding to it with the level of like personal vitriol that I am, because this is very personal to me. I really don't read it as I don't know in what universe it reads as a joke.
Yeah, it's bizarre.
I've just not got a clue. It's interesting because I have honestly been a little bit put off by a few of the things that the director has said over the course of the commentaries attached to this episode, but I wouldn't say that's a thing that bleeds through into my experience of the episode necessarily. I found that interesting. I was surprised by that clip because I don't feel like how that scene is framed makes it feel comedic. It's sort of surprising that he thinks that's what they think the intent is there, because it hasn't really come out in how they've directed it. So I don't understand. Sorry, this is my least deep analysis. So I'm just quite baffled.
Yeah, at most I can understand a director looking at this script overall and appreciating that scene in the sense that it has any meat on it as a dramatic scene. And that is how it is framed. But yeah, I think in a lot of ways, is it Jamie Childs directing this one? Yeah. I'm not the best at keeping track of directors, but I think by and large his direction exceeds what he has to say about his direction.
Yeah, I was wondering, because obviously you've done lots of the commentaries and lots of process in the commentaries, and sort of wondered how this struck you.
That remark by him has always puzzled me because it's not really addressed and then they just move right on. I don't have a deeper reading of that. It's just very odd that he reads it that way because, like you two have said, it's not filmed comedically and it's not scripted comedically. I assume they're just laughing together because, Jodie and Jamie are friends and they're just having a good time on the commentary. I find it really, really hard to parse exactly what was going on in that clip. Like, when I look at the script, that doesn't stand out to me as like a funny line at all. It just stands out to me as, wow, that's a weirdly dickish line that the script then doesn't do much with and that the rest of the series doesn't do much with. So nervous laughter maybe is the kindest way I could characterize it. It's puzzling. I don't have any deeper understanding of it than you two do. But let's move into the climax of the episode, which is all about heights. So let's watch the first clip there.
Ryan, Yaz, how are you with machinery and heights? That tentacle thing is guarding Carl's crane, so we go up this one.
What do we do when we get up there?
Don't worry, I've got a plan.
Really?
Well, I will have by the time we get to the top.
with this? Because if it's a problem, you don't have to do it.
I do. I can do this.
So this is another one where I'm gonna comment on the script, and just read the last section. Close up, Ryan's hand grasps the rung. He starts to climb. We're close on him. A major challenge. This is bravery. I mean, again, I really like the way that Yaz says, "You're all right with this. 'Cause if it's a problem, you don't have to do it." Like, I like the moment of someone else being proactive about it. I think there's a lot of compassion in the way that Yaz says that. I think it's quite naturalistic dialogue. It's sort of a nice moment between the characters. I do ultimately like that Ryan is not, because we'll get on to clips where he's sort of narratively shuffled through having to do things that he's uncomfortable with. And I do like that this is a moment where he's given a real opportunity to opt out and is able to opt in. I think that contrasts with a lot of the bike stuff that's happening earlier in the episode, where you can see he feels quite trapped. And that's arguably a barrier to him being able to calm down and sort of perform in that moment. So yeah, I think this is one of the stronger scenes for me.
To make a couple of observations. One, continuing the thread of redemptively reading Yaz, if we were to take seriously your proposition that her earlier line, slightly minimising the Ryan Graham conflict, is sort of her continuing to relate to him in this situation through a professional lens, this would be a sort of transitional moment where something in her brain has twigged and she's relating to him as a friend and a peer. That would be nice if I could believe that it would be intentional, but I guess at the end of the day, I don't care about authorial intent enough that matters that much. It's a nice moment. And the other thing is off the back of your, and this will come up again later in relation to one of the other clips, but off the back of your comments about Ryan having this as a real opportunity to opt out and opting in, what would be really nice if this were mirrored by some later point where Ryan is given an opportunity to opt out and it's like, yep, I can't do this one. Sorry, I know I'm much too likely to screw this up at a really important moment. I'm going to stay here, and is largely validated for that, is not made to look like the bad guy or an inept companion for opting out, maybe even something as cheesy as by dint of not going up the ladder or down the hatch or whatever. He is there at a crucial moment to spot something or stop something that's important to the resolution of the story. Cheesy stuff, but it's Doctor Who. That would be great. That doesn't happen at any point.
Yeah, that reminds me of I watched a talk today by someone in my general extended field that I respect, talking about their experience of being dyspraxic, just sort of get my brain whirring. And something that stuck in my mind that they said that kind of relates to Ryan and Risk and running down corridors and sort of that aspect of Who in Dyspraxia, is that working out that they were dyspraxic, finding out that they were dyspraxic, gave them the tools and sort of capacity to stop putting themselves in dangerous situations, because they were able to say, actually, some things are dangerous for me to do and I'm not good at them and I should stop, and that's kind of actually a relief. So yeah, we're going to reflect a bunch, I think, on sort of Ryan, danger, safety, and being disabled in a Doctor Who story. This is not the worst moment of that. I think it does fit into what will become a trend of like people putting Ryan's dyspraxia in the story by sort of dungeon mastering an obstacle for him, so that we can have the whole little moment where it's like, this character has dyspraxia. So Ryan needs to roll a dyspraxia save to go up the ladder, which is why we've got a ladder here, because this character has dyspraxia, and otherwise we wouldn't get to talk about that this week. That does happen a few times, and this is slightly one of them, but it's also his introductory episode, and dyspraxia has been a major framing thing at this stage, so sure. I like the note in the script that Yaz is as scared as Ryan is or should look it. I think that's nice, just recognising this is a generally scary and stressful situation. It's not this is absolutely fine for Yaz and scary for Ryan. Like, I think a slightly deeper character moment that could be available here or in these situations in general is to have a bit more sort of back and forth between characters under threat and the extent to which Ryan might be better or worse at certain things or need to do more boundary negotiation around doing certain things. Opens up conversations about like what people are actually comfortable with if people are scared. I think there's often not enough room in the busyness of a Doctor Who story to have people just be sort of responding in a characterful way to the things that they're going through, and I've often got a lot of time for that. So I kind of like that this ends up being an excuse to take a moment to recognise that climbing up one of these things is scary, rather than it just being a thing that sort of has to happen in the course of an action scene.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say I would not consider climbing a ladder to be the kind of obstacle my personal dyspraxia would get in the way of. I don't think that's in the range of motor skills where I would struggle from a dyspraxic basis. But I have a crippling fear of heights. Like, you know, you get me to go up a ladder that tall, I would have a panic attack about halfway because... And in some ways I find that it's easier to relate to Ryan in the frequent ladder moments by going, yeah, you know, maybe this isn't even a dyspraxia thing. Maybe he just, semi-relatedly to his dyspraxia, has discovered that he doesn't like climbing ladders because climbing ladders is scary for anyone.
Okay, last clip from Woman Who Fell to Earth.
She died like she lived, trying to help other people. I love you, Nan. And tomorrow, I'm going out there for you. Three, two,
So I do really like that closing scene, like particularly that the last pan out to the Doctor. Like, I think that's a moment where I feel that connection to I'm more interested in the version of the show that spirals out from this episode specifically than the one that we got. As sort of noted up front, I'm really glad that he doesn't successfully ride the bike at the end of the episode. I think if I was being like super ambitious with my hopes and dreams, we might not have looped round to doing the bike bit again. It's hard to say though, because I think that as a thought connects to a very different vision of how this episode worked and how this series was going to work within sort of all of the rest of the architecture as it is. This is a like reasonably strong closing note. I like that Graham and Grace aren't there. It's kind of sad that Ryan feels trapped in this incredibly symbolic loop with this thing that he's desperately struggling to do, but you can see why his character has ended up here over the course of the story that's happened. It just is for a bunch of reasons that are maybe more sad than Chibnall is necessarily going for.
Yeah, I mean, coming off the back of that, I will say this is probably going to connect up a few points from earlier, but like, Ryan isn't doing this for himself. Like, that is explicit and textual. He says, I'm going out there for you. He has ended up sort of psychologically painted into this emotional corner where he has to prove something. That previously he was able to externalize, my nan wants me to do this and I wish she'd get off my back about it, but now she's gone. he can't wish for her to get off his back about it. He is just left with this sense that he has something to prove in this task that he has no personal stake in, and is no good at, and could be perfectly happy not caring about, but life and circumstance has bottled him in this inescapable moment of this, Sisyphean task that he can't complete. And that's a really pregnant and interesting idea. I think if Chris Chibnall knew what he'd written there, that would be potentially a really compelling starting place. I think where this goes wrong is, and this relates back to something that was said, I think it was in the BBC News article, about not seeing Ryan as an inspiration. And the author of the article cites that they're really impressed by Chris Chibnall's decision not to elevate Ryan into an inspirational figure by not having him successfully ride the bike. And I feel for where that person is coming from and relate at a big first order level, but taking a step back and looking at Chris Chibnall in general and the wider Chibnall era and where this all goes, I think the problem with this scene is that Chris Chibnall does see Ryan as inspirational for keeping on trying here, and that's ultimately what this scene is doing in the context of the era. It's raising Ryan to an inspirational figure for doggedly persisting at this thing rather than recognizing the fact that actually what he's written is a story in which a young man has been trapped in the expectations of, neurotypical and able-minded society. And the Doctor here should be stepping in and helping him break out of this loop and see that riding the bike doesn't matter and Grace would be proud of him for other things. And that never happens. And that last scene really looks like it could lead that way. And then the rest of the era just fails to have that thought. And that's often the way with Chibnall's writing. I find that he has half of a thought. You can see the direction of momentum leading in a route that could go somewhere, and it just never comes together. And this is very much that.
Yeah, this is bravery.
Yeah, this is bravery indeed.
This is bravery. Bravery is also, sorry, I said Graham and Grace earlier there out of total compulsion. Obviously Grace could not be there in the scene.
Or could she?
Or could she? Yes. No, that's foreshadowing. So something, I mean, that was all beautifully put, and I really agree with that. Something that struck me about this scene in sort of the broader context of Doctor Who, and this is going on a weird little side meander, but we've just finished a big rewatch of the Peter Davison era, actually, which is, sort of relevant to this, a lot of Chris Chibnall's sort of baseline inspirational childhood Doctor Who. And an interesting thing that ends up going on, sort of to my mind, across the Davison era, is that you have companions who are interesting Doctor analogues and mirrors, but the ways in which they are only really highlighted at the end of those relationships, in particular Tegan and Turlough. Both sort of have interactions with the Doctor as they leave the TARDIS that are moments where I think, so this is very to my interpretation of classic Who, a dangerous thing to do on the internet, but I feel like a lot of their leaving connections with Five are moments where he is recognizing the extent to which these characters have have attributes to themselves or have gone on micro arcs that reflect things about himself, where he's come from. And watching this scene, I end up wanting that, particularly given the odd Davison era quality that can come about in Chibnall. I end up wanting that for the Doctor and Ryan, if nothing else. Like what's really interesting here is the opening note of this episode is Ryan speaking directly to the audience / complicatedly to himself as a character through the lens of vlogging, of sort of public social media, and it ends with him having a very intense private moment of grief and entrapment and cyclicality within personal hypersigils, while the Doctor, a completely new person, watches on. The Doctor is watching him in this little cycle, having just gone through this enormous change that we're not quite talking about in terms of the change that it is, as we discussed earlier. And that feels really potent. That feels like the start of a journey for two characters. And I'm open to the version of that doesn't start with sort of all the immediate parallels between them coming to light, but one that works its way towards a place where the Doctor can recognize some of, like we come away from this whole era and Ryan as a character, and I have no real idea what the Doctor was thinking in this moment as we watch her watch Ryan. And given how sort of structural this scene actually is, like, I have no memory of this scene until I watched it again. And I'm sort of sad that we don't move on from here with a sense that, like, this character was thinking about this other character. And I think that's reflected in the script in, I think, Chibnall summarizes the Doctor's presence as a guardian angel. And that just feels like the least interesting interpretation of what could be going on in this moment between two characters. Like,
yeah,
the Doctor isn't there to just watch, you know?
I want to read out that ending of the script just so everyone knows what we're saying here. So the ending of the script excerpt from the clip we're looking at says, jump cut, Ryan standing with the bike, frustrated, grieving, tears in his eyes. He sits back on the bike. Angle on from on high, watching from a distance on another hilltop is the Doctor. She watches as lonely Ryan tries and wobbles and falls, still not succeeding. A guardian angel. And then later, Revolution of the Daleks' script will kind of reference that as well. But yeah, it's very interesting framing of her there.
Yeah, and I think the direction does a really solid job of capturing a more compelling version of that moment than the script is offering. There are ways to shoot that are in keeping with the quite saccharine and underwhelming... Like, if I read that in a novel, I would not picture it and think, oh, what a great scene. I would go, oh, that's a bit much. But Charles's... Jamie's direction does really elevate, in general, the script. I think that last scene is altogether gorgeously shot and really powerful. And actually, Akina's score again has some nuances and subtleties to it that are really nice.
Yeah, with regards to infantilization as well, the A Guardian Angel bit really just undermines the one thing that, even though we've discussed that it's quite tragic, that's sort of going on for Ryan in this scene, is he's having a moment by himself. He's grieving by himself, doing this thing at the top of a hill. But he's not really by himself, because Chibnall's put his guardian angel here. He's not the little lost dyspraxic kid at the top of the hill, because he's got the Doctor here to be a pillar of hope, and that is trite. It robs the character of the one thing that he was sort of doing, if not exactly for himself, at least not under the observation of paternal force.
Yeah, I mean, to pull out my own last point, as part of agreeing with you, what I really like about the score here is that actually it's a little haunting, you know, like the note as we pan back on the Doctor emphasizes that there is a subtle wrongness to this alien figure intruding on this deeply private moment, and I think that's a much more interesting, much more authentic to the character of Ryan way to play that scene. And I say that as someone who's advocating for the Doctor nonetheless potentially pivoting off of this to intersect with Ryan's life in a positive way, because I think that's part of who the Doctor is. They are, you know, an otherness, a slight wrongness in the world. They are out of the sane, safe bounds of normal society, but the idea is that they are one of those that intersects with it positively. They are a good monster that, you know, barrels into the world destructively to its benefit, and I think that juxtaposition is part of what's compelling about the character, and something that in general Chris Chibnall fails to understand.
Yes, I mean, I have a whole bit that's much too long for this moment, but about cyclicality and trauma and science fiction and speculative fiction, and the ways in which cyclicality in terms of sort of literal time loops to non-chronological storytelling can be used to capture a sense of sort of entrapment and, in particular, trauma and grief, and the extent to which then subverting those sort of structural beats can then be symbolic of an escape, like into the weird, into recovery, into alternate realities. Very interested in sort of disrupted cycles. And it feels like all the bits of that are here. It's just that's sort of not what we're going to do. This episode very much sets up Ryan, the main character of the Chibnall era, and yet is described in an article that is being effusive about this as I think I'm probably going to misquote this every time I quote it off the top of my head.
Minor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, there's several layers to that. Like, he's a minor character. Yeah, a relatively minor character, which is also making a point about infantilization, if you're willing to read way too much into it.
Are we ready to move on into the Ghost Monument?
Yes.
This is a great, iconic clip first from the Ghost Monument. Let's watch that.
If that's the way it is, time to stop messing about.
What are you doing?
Fighting back.
No. Guns, never use them.
They're shooting at us.
I know.
They're gonna kill us with their guns.
He's got a point, Doc.
Put the gun down, Ryan.
What's your better idea?
Outthink them.
You can't outthink bullets.
Been doing it all my life.
Sorry. Call of Duty, man. I've trained for this. Who's next? See, that's what I'm talking about. That's how you do with things. Taking out the aliens. No. Where's the reload? Where's the reload? Where's the reload?
Made it worse?
Just a little bit, yeah.
Oh, there is a lot going on. There's a lot going on in that clip. Trying to be at all focus on things that are going on in that clip. So, obviously, Ryan does that very well. That's some very good shooting robots. I don't have a problem with that. Honestly, I quite like the idea of having a sort of parallel, real focus on Ryan doing something physical that he just can't do in the first episode. Oh, and surprise, also, disabilities are complex and spiky. There's things that he's practiced a lot that he's really, really good at. Now, it doesn't make sense that he would be any good at this on the basis of having played Call of Duty. And it is really infantilizing as a specific thing to have chosen, like, my god. So yeah, net complicated. Not a big problem with him miraculously being a sharp shot. Not like even a problem with that if it came out of absolutely nowhere. Honestly, more of a problem with the tone and sort of character age aspect of this, sort of once again not taking a moment where we could just treat the character as an adult. All of that being said, I do kind of love this for Ryan, having watched just a lot of clips of him falling off a bike. I'm like, yeah, which I guess connects back to my point about I'd quite like to see some of the contextualizing moments of him throwing the bike off the cliff, because, like, Ryan has a very frustrating life, and the fact that we end up seeing the bits of his intense emotional, like, arguable dysregulation ends up being infantilizing in a way that I don't think it even necessarily has to be. Like, look at the last day in a bit of Ryan's life. I completely understand him slightly losing it in this moment with just pure overexcitement that anything good is happening and that he's good at anything, because he's been in a sort of terrifying grief, blame, alien drama, like bicycle space opera situation that then left him nearly blowing up in the vacuum of space. And now he's here, and shooting robots. And like, sure, I think a 19-year-old guy is within his rights to do some howling at that stage.
Yeah, I mean, you know what would be great? Would be if the robots didn't get back up again, and the ethical discussion about the pros and cons of use of violence extended forward from that. That would credit Ryan as an entity within the narrative who can affect change, rather than someone who tries to do something, does it very competently, and the universe basically pops him down and says, no, Doctor's right.
Yeah, no. And no one takes a second to be like, wow, Ryan, that may have been contextually the wrong decision, but that was very impressive for anyone to have done.
Are we ready for the next 2 bits from the Ghost Monument? More ladders. Let's watch.
I want answers to this planet, and I think they're down there.
You sure about that?
No. Come on.
Why is it always ladders?
We need to get out of the tunnels.
It's light.
This exit ladder will take us up and out to the surface. What's up there?
Acetylene field.
Acetylene, like the gas.
That doesn't sound good.
We're running out of air and options, so let's go up. You okay?
It's not my favourite thing. Climbing ladders under pressure.
Can I just say, you are amazing.
Am I?
Think what you've gone through to be here, and you're still going. I'm proper impressed.
Thanks.
If it helps, focus on facts about acetylene as you climb. Did you cover it in MVQ?
Think we might have done, yeah.
Gotta be quick now, Ryan. Sorry.
So, I was today years old when I realised that that is a possibly deliberate parallel to Why Is It Always Snakes? Like Snakes and Ladders. Which I'm entertained by that.
This scene here, that conversation they have at the end there, is sort of the real world drab, microwave prefab burger to the hypothetical imaginary banquet of the Doctor and Ryan relating along an axis of the ways that they are respectively, a sort of fantasy figurative portrait of qualities which I would say I have always identified with as a dyspraxic person, and a real bounded, human realist portrait of what living with dyspraxia is like, that me and Nix have been generally positing as a potential way that including a dyspraxic character in the show Doctor Who could potentially be a really colourful and intellectually rewarding exercise. Like, this is what we get, is the Doctor doing a good pal check-in, you okay? And doing a very weak lemon squash 10th Doctor, you're great moment, as some amount of emotional support, and that's better than nothing, I think. And then shoehorning in some leverage for some exposition about acetylene, because we're trying to harken back to the 1980s, harkening back to the 1960s, attempting to realise, like Sidney Newman's vision of the show is educational.
Harking back to the Edge of Destruction, specifically. Listing slightly wrong space facts into the void.
But yeah.
I'm not sure if there's a way to convey this properly in audio, but just looking back over the script, the Doctor, can I just say you're amazing, Ryan? Am I? Doctor says the next bit. Ryan, thanks, full stop. It's
very characterful.
Oh, God. Yeah, I mean, this, building on sort of what I said about ladders earlier, I understand why this happens, and happens over and over again. I understand why we do the bit where there's just sort of a thing that Ryan needs to overcome his dyspraxia to do. However, I do find it just a bit uncreative. I don't actually think there is a strict need for this to be how the story is constructed. Like, yes, in universe, a ladder is here and Ryan needs to deal with it, but this is a decision that has been made by writers. This is how the story is being constructed, and it's being constructed to make use of this character in this particular way, generating these kind of moments, giving opportunities for other characters, again, to relate to him via his disability and relate to his disability as a barrier to something that everyone needs to get done. Like, Ryan is trapped in a perpetual bike-themed space opera where it just comes up again and again that he needs to do a little dyspraxic thing in order for the plot to move along. And yeah, that is fine. I'm not saying that that's awful, but it's just not the most creative sort of use of that representation that I think is available.
I mean, what's really depressing about it, and I say this as someone, a rare person who finds the strengths of the Ghost Monument easier to focus on than the flaws. I'm not going to say they outweigh them in a strict numerical sense, but watching it, I find that the good parts stick with me and the bad parts slide off a bit. And that's nice. But, I mean, taking a moment to focus on one of the many, many flaws, what's really depressing is that this was written by Chris Chibnall. So the sheer lack of creativity on display is that he did the ladders the previous episode. And in this episode, he's again remembered that Ryan needs a bit about his dyspraxia and has included the same obstacle. And that is really a crunch moment where, particularly watching with the benefit of hindsight, you really see the wheels come off of how much vision there is going forward. No, nor is it a very high ladder, not to be that harsh, but I'm not surprised that Ryan is fine about that ladder. It's not that high of a ladder as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I think there's the edges of something interesting in the idea of struggling under pressure. And in a world where we're engaging with Ryan's psychology and the sort of traumatized hyper-attachment he now has on the bike thing as a result of Grace's death, building that out into... Even building out, my God, you could have this moment between the Doctor and Ryan by themselves for a second be a moment where the Doctor says something about Grace? Or is it in the shape of, this is obviously a lot, isn't it? This is the last time we were in this situation. Things got really hard. Again, not, got a world of ideas for exactly how you would do that, but just you've got this. This is actually the moment where they are thrown back together in a tiny high pressure parody of the situation that they met in, that killed someone Ryan deeply loved and led to the going round and round in circles on the bike that we saw at the end of the last episode, that we saw the Doctor watching, and now she's alone with him, having been there for that, having watched him from a distance, having connected with him again, and now this. Do something with that.
I was just going to say, can you imagine a version of this episode and this season that retained the framing device of Ryan's little vlogs, that would be such an easy in. It's cheap, and we would be rolling our eyes at its cheapness in a universe where anyone thought to have that motif, but it would be such an easy in for... You could have the episodes practically as is and bookend them with little minute Ryan recounting, the wonderful journeys that he went on with the Doctor and some amount of his interiority and some amount of dramatic irony, and it would be anything.
Even when they get back, I think I would find one that's just titled "Hey!" that opens with "I went to space."
Yeah. So we can't keep going consecutively because the next few episodes I couldn't find anything in really to do with Ryan's dyspraxia. For Rosa, arachnids, pitting, and demons. But Kerblam absolutely does. So let's watch this first Kerblam clip.
You're a ninja at this, Ryan.
This was my life before you. Mind you should have seen me when I just started. First month, total nightmare. Takes me a while to learn things physically. Get there in the end, but just some stuff takes me a bit longer. Luckily, I had mates who covered for me in the beginning.
This episode seems more interested in Ryan and his dyspraxia than most of Series 11, I think. What do we think of that first clip there?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, we'll let the gap between Ghost Monument and Kerblam speak for itself. But, yeah, no, I mean, I like that moment. Peering ahead a bit, I sort of like the Ryan dyspraxia stuff in Kerblam right up to a point, which is sort of a beautiful microcosm of Kerblam in general. But yeah, no, I mean, in and of itself, that is a good moment that forms part of the period in which Kerblam really seems like it's going somewhere positive. It's another case of Ryan explaining his own disability as like a little refresher in case the audience didn't catch the first couple of episodes. But again, it's possible to conceive of a world in which this motif has any weight and sort of gestures towards the fact that really is a cycle that you find yourself in as a disabled person. You have to constantly make decisions about disclosure and explain your condition to people who don't fully understand it or haven't heard of it before or whatever, particularly as a dyspraxic disabled person, because as is widely noted, it's not a hugely understood or discussed condition. And yeah, I think his summary to Kira there feels like someone who's had to do this a lot, and has a sort of boilerplate, this is how I describe it, particularly to a pretty girl quality. And yeah, I sort of like the note the Doctor saying, you're really good at this actually. And Ryan saying, yeah, it took some practice, but with practice I can get good at things. That is all what I want to see out of like just the base layer of dyspraxic representation, you know, the bothering to include it at all, assuming that we're not going to get a really deep exploration of it. This passes the first test with what I would consider flying colours.
Yeah, very much agree. I think it's also actually stronger in the context of the upcoming bit.
Yeah, so let's look at our other two clips from Kerblam then. Let's watch.
Get ready to stick it to rule number 1.
You did this in your last job?
Yeah, once.
How'd it go?
Really badly. Sprained ankle and the final warning.
Come on, we have to find Kira.
I should let you know I have a coordination problem. Not super serious, but you know, makes life really interesting and frustrating and difficult, especially at moments like this.
You don't have to come. I can find Kira on my own.
Mate, that's not how we roll. Is it, Yaz?
Nope. We're all in.
Dispatch, here we come. Oh my days.
From that! We're gonna go! Going too fast!
We did it! That was amazing! We're amazing! Charlie, you're the man! I can't drop down there!
Of course you can! We both can! Right? On 1, 2, 3...
We did it! We're not dead! We're totally not dead!
Yeah, I mean, that really works until it doesn't. But yeah, on the subject of things sort of falling apart as they go. Honestly, I really like that we get Ryan has to explain dyspraxia again in the course of the same episode. I think that's inching towards the idea of doing a little bit of a bit. And I like that under slightly higher pressure, it's both a more sort of rushed explanation and also one that carries a little bit more sort of raw emotional sharing. Like, I think those two little beats actually work quite nicely together. And I think there's a world where, like, if someone like Stephen Moffat was playing with this structure or idea, there's a lot that could be rinsed out of it as, like, a comedy beat that's genuinely on Ryan's side. Which is a complicated thing with dyspraxia in general. And sort of riffing on comedy, generating comedy really actively out of disability-related topics. Obviously, it's incredibly sensitive, but also I think there's a huge amount that can be done, particularly if you're going to look from like characters' actual perspectives. If you're going to build bits out of sort of interesting and offbeat aspects of reality, there's interesting things that could be done with that beat. I think the start of it's done here. I think Ryan generally opting for this, and the note that he's done something sort of parallel this daft before in reality, and therefore both has sort of a palpable sense of the risk going on here, and a general, it feels grounded that he's up for it at all. I do think jumping off the thing onto the other thing is just it feels bizarre. I know I've just said that doing the same beat again worked quite well. I think doing the same beat again with no sense that you're building on it or iterating or riffing on it, doing it sort of straight up again for the same output, I don't get that. I don't think that works very well. And I do think it pushes... It's another example of a situation just pushing Ryan like way further than he said his boundaries are able to go, and expecting him to do something that is basically unreasonable.
It's just a bridge too far. Like, I love Tosin's performance in that first bit. The like general bullet point through having dyspraxia. I really like the way that he inflects all of that, and the little like determined no, this is who we are moment is such a sweet little encapsulation of the idea of this as a point in the character's journey where he's still getting something positive out of being a Doctor Who companion, both, Ryan and perhaps Tosin, like, this is still a rewarding learning experience in which he is being challenged and challenging himself, and this is affecting him positively as a person, and he is making brave decisions, and that is all really nice and comes together really nicely, and he does the brave thing, and it goes well. He manages it. Woo, yes. 1,000,000 to 1 chances. Of course, they should have been splattered at the bottom of that ramp, but whatever. They did it. Well, hey, disability didn't get in the way. He had the option to say no, and he chose to do the thing, and I think it was absolutely all completely the right choice. And then, because circumstance requires it, and circumstance didn't have to require it, but it was written to, he is asked to do something a whole degree more dangerous, calmly says, I think that might be a line for me, having just a minute ago said, I have a disability that makes all of this harder for me than the rest of you, and the text absolutely demands that he nonetheless just put a penny in the slot machine, turn the crank, do the overcoming his dyspraxia and succeeding again, because it can't conceive of letting him just sit this one out, or doesn't have time to have him be pressured into this and fail, and the other characters have to acknowledge that they pushed him too far, there's just not time for anything other than, well, he overcame his disability through effort once, so he can do it again, and it's just a bit where that all falls short.
Or he's stuck here now on that specific one, and that is interrelated to the plot in some way.
Yeah, indeed. It would not be hard to have him have to stay up there and that actually deliver him somewhere useful, but...
Particularly given how often the Chibnall era has, really awkward moments where characters need to be split into groups or, the conditions of things need to change. It's interesting that it's overlooked that this is actually a thing that could be utilised to create, sort of character legitimate reasons for a group to split up or go in different directions or something to happen in a different way.
Moving forward from Kerblam, nothing in The Witchfinders. It takes you away. There's nothing directly about Ryan's dyspraxia, but I think it is interesting that he goes along with, how the Doctor writes on the wall to deceive the blind girl Hannah in the episode about, what they're doing to ostensibly keep her safe and everything. Ryan takes part in that with no issue, and he gets a little shirty with Hannah as well. I thought that was kind of interesting in that it's to do with disability representation. It never directly equivocates anything with Ryan, but just kind of the manipulation of Hannah being something the episode is chill with just feels kind of a piece with the era, maybe.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. Like, the Doctor initiates that manipulation, and I think that's an interesting and compelling character beat for the Doctor. The, gestures at a version of the character who is more interestingly manipulative, a bit more McCoyic, that flitters around the edges, seems to be an interest of Ed Hyams, but doesn't quite materialize into being a concrete aspect of the character, at least yet. In the televised version of the character, it certainly never sharpens into focus. But Ryan is just sort of left going along with the Doctor's gambit, and we don't get a sense of whether he's fine with it or not fine with it. He just complies. And yeah, the most characterization he really gets here more is to do with his ongoing parental abandonment issues, which one could arguably tie into the general theme of infantilization of the character. He behaves a bit childishly here. He doesn't display a great deal of emotional maturity when speaking to a vulnerable younger person than him, which is unsympathetic characterization that could be interesting and deliberate, although I don't know, this story also has Ryan finally reconciling with Graham, so it doesn't present a consistent position on Ryan, I think.
Yeah, this is an episode I like quite a lot of pieces of, but I think Ryan suffers a little bit for not being already a strong shape of character, and just having to warp a little bit around the needs of quite a busy story. Like, there's not really room for him to take issue with what's going on because he feels empathy as another disabled person. And I think that's sort of a symptom of the overall extent to which dyspraxia has been slotted in where there's room for a dyspraxia moment, but not used as a inspiration to shape the character's emotional responses or the stories that they are involved in.
Yeah, I mean, it's notable, really, that the division of labour here ends up being Graham goes and gets a juicy scene with the... Solitract. That's the one. With the Solitract projection of Grace, which I think Ryan ultimately is around for a few seconds towards the end of, and part of the illusion breaking down. But, like, the meat of the matter goes to Graham there, while Ryan gets to look after Anna for a bit. And that's not necessarily flawed, but as noted, Ryan doesn't do any relating to this abandoned, disabled child in a way that he, as a frequently infantilized, disabled character with abandonment issues, might. He's just sort of at a bit of a remove from her. And that could in itself be compelling, but not really with the amount of time that there is for it. And it wouldn't at all have been a worse idea, and could well have been a better idea, to show Graham left behind looking after a child and engage with an amount of his complicated relationship with the idea of family through being put in a much more overtly parental position that perhaps he would rather be in than this complicated having to look after an adult, and have Ryan get a powerful and compelling scene about his nan, who, again, the entire series started with framing itself around his grief at the loss of Grace, and has somehow pivoted to being more about Graham's.
Yeah. So those Graham kind of notes, yeah, those are concluded in It Takes You Away and in the Battle of Ranskoav Kolos, as we have the fist bump, and then we have the real union of them in the finale where they're working together. He's calling him granddad, the fist bumping. It's all ooey and gooey and lovely, and that's all resolved. It makes it very clear that the tension in the blame it on the dyspraxia stuff is long since, I don't know if resolved is the right word, ignored, set aside. It's gone. They're together. They're best of pals now. And as we continue into resolution, we even see, Graham, we see how close they are in contrast to Ryan's dad, Aaron, and how he's portrayed in the episode. He hasn't been around. He wasn't at the funeral. Then he's off doing business with microwaves. The Dalek seizes onto Aaron, and there's a big emotional climax as Ryan's trying to save Aaron from the Dalek and keep him in the TARDIS and everything. So let's watch a clip from that, which does bring up Ryan's dyspraxia. So let's watch that.
Dad, I'm here for you. I forgive you. I love you, Dad. Take my hand. they've got you. Not bad for a kid with dyspraxia, right?
Not bad at all.
I wish that this scene felt earned.
Just a kid with dyspraxia just sticks out to me.
Yeah, my God, he does just consistently refer to himself as a child, and it's really strange. It feels like a weird moment to bring it up. Honestly, it doesn't feel... I mean, I know like what has gone on there has been quite physical, but everything about Not Bad for a Kid with Dyspraxia just feels like it comes from like a Saturday morning cartoon, and not the moment that the like general swelling strings telling us has just happened in the narrative. Like, don't know what the correct response ought to be in that moment. Maybe a bit of crying, a bit of howling. I don't know. But yeah, it just doesn't feel like it carries the weight of anything that's just happened, and comes back to the fact that sort of Ryan's self-reflection as a thread is something that's got a little bit lost. Somehow he's not managing to say any more about himself. Like eternally falling off the red bike, Ryan is stuck saying the first 3 things about himself forever, sort of regardless of what the situation is, whether it's a ladder, or space Amazon, or rescuing the dad that abandoned him by shouting a Dalek into the sun. He's Ryan. He's got dyspraxia, but he's carrying on.
I agree wholeheartedly with your point. It is just a slightly odd moment for him to bring it up. It's not wholly inappropriate, but it's just a little off balance. That was a feat of strength, but not massively a feat of coordination. Dyspraxia is a complicated condition, but yeah, it does speak to that sense of just even Chris Chibnall, the author of the character, finding that he has nothing new to say. In this Ryan-focused story, this the most Ryan-focused story.
Yeah, it sort of feels like what he would say in his vlog about this moment, and it's really not what he should be saying in his vlog about this moment, because this is quite a big moment in a number of ways. It feels like Ryan is celebrating having successfully done his side quest of the week. Like, loving his dad is the wobbly ladder of right now, with sort of all the same structure and stakes and a similar level of like, well done, you did do the thing from the Doctor. Like, this is Ryan's Ryan challenge of the week, and those have one structure. Even if the thing they contain within it is so emotionally enormous, it will just sort of gravitate back to form.
When all you have is dyspraxia, everything looks like a bike.
If we can move into series 12, both Spyfalls have some relevant stuff. Why don't we watch the relevant bits from Spyfall Part 1? So that's it's a clip without commentary, and then it's a bit of the same thing with commentary. Let's have a look at that.
Now, man. You never used to step in the car.
I should have got it in. I'll get it in next time.
You've been sick.
Oh,
though.
buckets.
Is this Cardiff or is it Sheffield?
Cardiff, yeah.
It is Cardiff, yeah.
In some warehouse. This is actually very slippy, very dangerous. Uh-oh, he's pulling up. Let's go. Get your form right. Oh, yeah. Oh, he's shooting. Look at that form.
It really pained you to have to be not very good, didn't it?
Yeah, but you know what? I was getting actually the buckets in, and Chris can verify because I can show you can see the rushes, and I was actually making a lot of shots.
Yeah, and I wrote this in because I knew you played basketball.
Yeah, I know.
But then I had to make you not as good because you're Ryan rather
because
than
I'm
Tosin.
Ryan, I know. And I was really upset because I was thinking, damn, they're going to think I'm rubbish.
everyone's going to see this.
Did you do all? How were the other guys that day?
They're actually good because like I actually played with one of the guys in there.
Oh, so basketball.
I'm going to start by saying that commentary track is not the deepest commentary track I've ever heard. Like, bless Tosin. That's some very, very sweet, very earnest, just being a young lad.
Yeah, I think I enjoy it more than the original scene. Like, I'd quite like that just layered over the top. I mean, I come to this with the, I don't know how much this would be controversial, opinion that Ryan should just be good at basketball, or Ryan is allowed to be good at basketball. I think it's sad that Tosin doesn't get his sort of Matt Smith football moment, where something that he's just very good at is able to be demonstrated straightforwardly in the show as an aspect of his character. And honestly, I think I would prefer, if we have to have it at all, the whole basketball arc, which is Ryan's arc this season. Well, in the first episode, you try and shoot a hoop, and it doesn't go well. But later, you need to throw a ball. But yeah, insofar as the basketball arc is what we're doing this season, I think it would be honestly more interesting to have him just be good at this, because this is a thing that he's practiced and cares about and feels relaxed doing, and is a part of his friend group and sense of community and personal identity. Like, it is not beyond dyspraxic people to be good at sport. And sort of going back to the thing I said up front about habit forming behaviors and the things that can come from doing things repeatedly for the first time, there are some sport related tasks that I'm like really good at. A lot of them I'm terrible at, and none that I'm good at enough in a coherent enough group to be anything but a liability for any sport. But that really doesn't rule out this or this particular aspect of this sport for Ryan. Like, I think you could easily have him, for example, slightly physically struggling with the busyness of moving around the court, which is generally the thing that really, really gets me. I completely lose track when that many people are moving at once and become a complete liability to myself and everyone else. But you could easily have Ryan sort of struggling with that aspect of it, not bumping into people, not being able to do other things, but someone deliberately passing to him because they know he is actually very good at throwing the ball when it comes to it. Because, and I feel like there's a lot of that. I mean, obviously, part of this comes from just Tosin's interest in the sport and being good at it in real life. But I feel like a lot of that's carried in his physicality in that moment. And yeah, I think it would be more interesting to set this up now as a thing that actually he's just good at, and then come back to it later and have other characters be surprised by this, expect this to be a Ryan Dyspraxia moment TM, wherein he does go up the ladder and well done. And in fact, he is just very straightforwardly not bothered by having to do the thing. It's like, oh, this is cool. I'm quite good at this. Great. And it goes well. And that is how you subvert the pattern that's been set up so far. I don't think that would be as interesting if that wasn't the pattern that has been set up so far. But yeah, it just feels like another long form bike ladder situation that is a bit complicatedly insulting.
Yeah, Ryan doesn't need another bike. I get that the point of this scene is, to have some variety and not literally reuse the bike motif, but nonetheless be introducing. But yeah, no, be reintroducing to the audience after the show's been off air for longer than usual. That Ryan has dyspraxia. Remember, that's one of his 2 character traits. He also has issues with dads, but to be fair, that's been resolved now. So he is down to 1 character trait. So everyone remember, he's got dyspraxia. But again, as you point out, there are other ways to do that balance some of the aspects of the condition a bit more evenly. Or you could, have an opening montage of him just tripping up on regular things in a literal or figurative sense. Going to open a can and he pulls the ring pull off wrong and can't open it. He stubs his toe. He drops his phone and the screen breaks. Just a general little, the many Kafkaesque indignities of day-to-day life as a dyspraxic person. And then he's playing basketball with his mates and he just shoots a perfect hoop because actually it's not all, failure and indignity, some stuff you can get good at. And I'm not saying that there aren't dyspraxic people who like basketball who aren't struggling with it, sure. But nonetheless, I think, as Nick's well highlights, this just feels like the laziest option for this idea. If you have to do this idea at all, do something more interesting than this version of it.
Yeah, and let the actor demonstrate that he's good at this, because we let Matt Smith do that, and it was a bit ludicrous, and I find the scene a lot more charming now I know sort of the actor's backstory, and this just, like, yeah, just feels like a moment where another actor could have that level of a moment, like, looking back to sort of the general idea of Doctor Who as this big sort of shared public forum and piece of art of general community interest. Like, I think it's sad that Tosin gets to be in this and doesn't get the opportunity to have a silly little moment written in that's about him being very good at a sport that he's very good at, because he's on Doctor Who. It'd be nice for him. For allowed things that basic. Matt Smith was.
It's a bit sad, just Chibnall saying, like, oh, I wrote this in because I know that you're good at basketball, but then I had to write you being bad at it because it's Ryan.
We hear more Tosin Cole input on our next two clips. So it's no commentary first. It's just a couple of seconds to see the clip, and then we rewind and we see it with Tosin's input. Let's watch that.
Shall we go up?
I'm sure they'll be able to find other jobs, won't they?
Hey, watch this little trip. Watch this little trip.
Where?
It's coming up. Yep.
On purpose?
Yeah.
Is that one? Yeah, God, nice. It's so hammy.
Come on. Nervous, you know what I mean? It's little nuances, man.
Can't believe you're reviewing him on the commentary.
I am.
Will you be giving him a grade at the end?
I'm not hammy at all.
I can never get anything right, man.
Oh, hard cut to like several hours of deep analysis of the character material that Jenna Coleman got for Clara.
It's not in the script as well. We can see there's no stage directions at all for them going up the stairs. So that Tosin's totally right there. That was all him.
Yeah, and I really like that beat. Like, is well physically acted. Going back to what I was saying, I do think one of the things that he really brings to the role is like an interest in the physicality. And it is exactly the sort of thing that I do all the time. I think it's well scaled and managed. Like I'm glad that it happens in a moment where it's not a big deal. He doesn't fully fall over. He just sort of mucks up and very quickly catches himself and gets on with it. Like, naturalistic moment of straightforward, granular representation.
Yeah. The sadness here is fundamentally in the paucity and the fact that he's having to work this in just to bring it into things in general. Fundamentally, I think it's a great move on his part.
A little bit from Spyfall too. Let's watch that.
You got us level, Ryan. Good lad. I can fly a plane. Can't ride a bike, but I can fly a plane.
Yeah, weird. As someone who has a coordination disability and can drive, and has a remarkably alright time with driving, I think partly because it entertains some primal ADHD that's going on in my brain, more than it's a problem for certain parts of my dyspraxia. I'm sort of roughly here for the concept of what's being got at here. I do wish Ryan could be psychically freed from the prison of the bike. I feel oppressed by the bike at this stage, and I feel that he's oppressed by it as well.
In the vein of redemptive reading, I can sort of believe that flying a plane particularly flying a plane via the medium of the Doctor helping you, is sort of more like playing a video game.
Yeah, he's got a little phone game to do it, hasn't he? This is where the fact that I've not seen Spyfall more than once and deleted most of my memories of it shortly after it was over, in order to make room for the psychic weight of that thing with the Doctor and the Master that happens. Things like this have just been cleansed from my memory with the bleach of that. Yeah, looking at the script, he is using something on his phone, which makes me feel even less like the bike comparison is necessary.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a similar flavor to that resolution scene, isn't it? Where it's just like he's saying, I've dyspraxia, but I did this well. And then it's just like a very small comment.
Yeah, which, isn't unbelievable, particularly for someone who has slightly oppressively had his life and identity framed by this, this being framed back at him, his whole relationship with Graham. Like, there could be something in this if it was going anywhere. I don't think critiquing this or understanding this or looking at the internality of this is the representation that we're getting. I think this is the representation that we're getting.
Yeah, it's a cute enough moment in itself. No hard objection to the moment. It's just the degree to which it really represents a slice of the, uniform infantilizing prism that has formed over the course of the seasons that we're clipping past.
Actually, given we're on the subject of Ryan and driving, I'm going to take a second out of analysing him doing straightforwardly physical tasks to say a Ryan beat that I would have liked to see, and this is obviously personal to my taste and interpretation of things, but I would have liked to see some of Ryan properly interacting with the TARDIS and the TARDIS console, because one of the things about dyspraxia is this often quite discombobulated relationship, not just to space and time in the abstract, but to processes, sequences, the operation of things. And I think some of the extent to which the TARDIS requires a mix of complete poetic logic, an interest in just scrummaging around with all sorts of different bits in a way that sort of is confident but also potently nervous, and just sort of hitting it sometimes. The whole process of interacting with the TARDIS is a weird techno dance poetry that I would really like to see Ryan in communication with. And I'm sad we don't get any of him potentially having a easier time with the logic of the TARDIS than other characters, not because dyspraxia magically makes him better at understanding it on any level, but in part because he's got less of an instinctive sense that things should operate according to a consistent order and that he should be able to get things right. I can see a lot of people like Graham approaching the TARDIS as a bus driver and being like, well, there must be a gear stick somewhere, there's an on button, I know how vehicles work, I drive a vehicle every day of my life. And being genuinely a bit surprised when Ryan, coming at it with no such preconceptions, that he knows how it works or how to interact with it, but just approaching it very honestly and curiously and pressing things and being open to its logic, is able to get it to do little bits and things in ways that he just can't get his head around because it refuses to obey the sensible, consistent, grounded rules of a bus.
Yeah, I think, honestly, that something like that would be near the pinnacle of what I would have loved to see with Ryan as a character interacting with the things in Doctor Who that I consider very, metaphorically potent as a person with dyspraxia. Actually, I will take a moment to highlight, because I think we managed to really skim by this, kind of because it's not really discussed in much of the literature about dyspraxia that we were touching on when setting up our entire parameters for the condition, but I don't think we've really noted the ways that it interacts with time, particularly, apart from mentioning them in passing. We've gestured that time is one of the things that it trips you up on, but I think we didn't really frame that particularly. So just as a brief aside, my brain doesn't know how long a second is, and therefore doesn't know how long a minute is, and therefore doesn't know how long an hour is, and it will never know those things. 5 seconds might feel completely different from 5 seconds to another, and it depends. Everyone's like this a bit, obviously, time flies when you're having fun, whatever, but that turned up to 11 is my experience of time. What I am doing vastly dictates how fast time moves, and that is so much the case that it's quite palpable. And so I can be really punctual if I'm paying a lot of attention to time, and if I'm distracted in the least for what feels like a moment, I have lost all sense of the track of time. And that is one of the ways in which I find Doctor Who to be a very potent metaphor for dyspraxia.
Yeah, very, very much agreed. And the sense, like, while we're doing a bit of this flavour of thing, the sense that time and objects and like time and space and the things within them, like minutes and hours and objects, both menial and special, behave as if driven by their own capricious magical logic, because you are a force of chaos in the universe that you can't entirely control. You destroy your objects, you lose yourself in time, in space, you lose objects in time, in space. Like, you're scrabbling perpetually. A world that not only doesn't make sense, changes when you don't look at it, and sometimes changes when you look at it, because you're changing it. I think that's part of why I have a bit of a complicated poetic relationship with the concept of, like, the TARDIS in particular within Doctor Who, because it just, the idea that you're living in a living world that is on the brink of making sense, but doesn't really, and that you're in constant communication with, and might just sort of fuck you over at any given moment, but can work with you if you're willing to work with it, speaks to my, like, experience of reality. And I'm not big on magical thinking. This doesn't reflect sort of things that I believe about how the universe works. It just, which is part of why I think I enjoy it translated into speculative fiction and sci-fi, you know? Why I like Douglas Adams so desperately much. And yeah, these are all elements of the interiority of the experience. It would be nice to see in Ryan as a character moving through a big and disorientating universe. In some ways, would have liked to see travelling on the TARDIS to be a levelling factor in this group, rather than something that just sometimes throws up dyspraxia-themed QuickTime event.
Yeah, very well said. Do we want to move forward?
Yeah.
Okay. Orphan 55, Ryan romance, but not Ryan dyspraxia. Then Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror does have a relevant clip. Let's watch that one.
Oh look, a dyspraxia-themed QuickTime event.
Deep breath, and Ryan jumps. Yaz grabs his hand. He's made it.
Yeah, I like Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror. This is a perfectly adequate moment in it.
It's such a condensed Yaz. Here we go, Ryan. No way. Graham. Go on, Ryan. Yaz. You've got this. Get up the ladder, Ryan. You don't have a choice.
Yeah, it's very missable as well, but I guess it is in there.
Yeah, I guess some points for this not being like 3 minutes long. It's there, but it's not overwhelming.
Then nothing in Fugitive or Praxis that I could see. Not really in Can You Hear Me either, but it does develop more of kind of the basketball stuff, just in that it's got lots of Ryan's mate that he was playing basketball with. Then in Haunting of Villa Diodati, you guys might find this one relevant. Let's watch it, see what we think.
Such a jaunty air. Is it popular in the colonies?
Yeah. My nan taught me, but I always get the keys wrong. But she always said there's no reason not to try.
I should practice more. But I confess, I prefer to write. Even though my efforts are weak, I could never hope to match the achievements of my parents.
My nan would say stick with it.
So, Ryan has no idea who Mary Shelley is, does
he? Yeah, it doesn't land as if he does. I honestly am quite sentimental about this one. I think partly because, well, two reasons. I think it comes the closest to capturing the point about sequence processing and time of any of the bits that we've done really at all. This feels like a more granularly sort of weighty and interesting little dyspraxia moment. It's also tied into sort of character beats and conversations, and Ryan getting to have a moment that's not like that is about his dyspraxia, but is actually defined by him doing a thing imperfectly, but that still being charming for someone else, and that being like really adequate for what that moment needed. So yeah, I think that's just by virtue of being a reasonably well written scene works better. But also on like a bit of a personal level, if there's anything that's my like riding a red bike, it's trying to play musical instruments. I'm not good at it. I don't think I'm ever going to be good at it. And I have been doing it for many years. And I really relate to the straightforward hand problems, the best way I could put it, that Ryan is having here, where, you know, information, what the music is, goes in, and what comes out at the hand level is a slightly garbled, glitched version of what you were trying to do. Like, that really speaks to me. And I think it's portrayed physically well, and I'm really glad that it's in a moment that just isn't making a big deal of it.
I honestly really appreciate the little dichotomy here of Ryan Dyspraxia moment being set up as like a little parable for the audience. You're gonna be imperfect at some things that it would be really nice to be really good at. But you know what? Some people are going to find that really, really annoying. That's just a fact of life. Some people are going to be kind of pissed off that you're no good at the thing, and you're taking up time and space in which they could be charming and sexy. And other people are going to not care that you're not that good, and care that you're trying. And that's what your life is going to be. It's going to be full of a mix of people being able to tolerate the ways that you're different at different levels.
Yeah, that's really, really nicely put. Also, people are going to fancy you anyway, and a lot of this stuff isn't about the performance, it's about demonstrating that you're interested in the world. You've got it's the difference between trying at the bike for no clear reason and demonstrating to others that you try at things because you are interested in the universe. And this is a much more optimistic vision of like what's good about Ryan being his relentless willingness to try.
Yeah. Ascension doesn't have much in it, but the Timeless Children does.
All right, Ryan. They're on the march. You know what to do. We're relying on you.
Did I mention I've never been the greatest shot?
Now.
Oh! I did it! In the hoop! Swish!
Great shot.
You come for humans, you come for me. Ryan Sinclair, we defeated the Cybermen. Well, me, technically it's me.
There are always more. Get inside now. Now!
It's almost like Ryan unlocks a greater level of auto-infantalisation by succeeding at a thing. He isn't rewarded with maturity. He is rewarded with getting to be 10.
Oh, it's just not good. Not my most deep reflection. We were saying earlier, also this is also not a deep reflection, we were saying earlier that we appreciate that Ryan actually says Cyberman.
Traditional unit fashion.
In the sort of early classic Doctor Who sense.
You've got the postman and the milkman and the Cyberman. He comes and delivers the cyber.
I mean, Ryan does have a sort of reviving robot theme. That's certainly a thing that happens to him twice. That he thinks he solved the issue of robots with violence, and it turns out that there are more. Which actually, these two scenes together act as a sigil that unlocks the Cybermasters. That's ultimately what Ryan has done. By shooting the robots that come back to life and then destroying the Cybermen, he allows those two ideas to be combined through him, and thus the Cybermasters reign eternal.
Bold take.
The Series 12 basketball arc, it's really an arc. It's like a binary thing. He doesn't do it in the first episode, and then he does do it in the last episode. I think it's a very Chibnall storytelling thing. Like, he's spoken directly with Unit, how his idea was, what if I took Unit apart so I could bring them back together? It's like this, it's not really an arc, because there's literally not an arc to it. It's just, it's more like a switch. Yeah, this kind of storytelling.
So many kinds of patronizing at once. And I think the thing that I find, other than, this being a set of decisions that were made, really bleak about the ways in which it's patronizing, and I think this comes in part from a lot of my first teenage layer of being involved in sort of media discussions and debates about things on the internet, being of the flavor, is this appropriate or inappropriate, kind or not kind, interesting or not interesting writing of a female character? Well, the female character in the story says, I love to be written this way at a particular point, so it must be fine because this is a character-driven and empowering set of decisions. And it's like, well, no, because they're not real. And they didn't say that. And that's not the end of this conversation. It's something to be part of the conversation. And sort of in a similar flavor of thing, I really struggle with this moment being sort of sold back to us as, look, this is what Ryan wants. Look at how happy Ryan is. He did it in the hoop. We should feel happy for him getting the basketball thing that he wanted. And the way that just sort of seals the Uberos of Ryan's infantilization by making him the defining perpetrator of it, despite the fact that he is a fictional character and nothing in this scene had to happen, let alone like this. It's a very exploded diagram of my problem with that moment. But
no, I think it was a point well made, if in a very dyspraxic way, which is what we're ultimately here to demonstrate.
Do we have any other thoughts on In the Hoop before we move on to the final clip?
Yeah, I mean, to vaguely confer Nix's wonderfully made point, there's a dichotomy, right? There's the hypothetical idea of the better season of Doctor Who and Ryan that we envisaged spanning out from Woman Who Fell to Earth, in which Ryan is freed from the bicycle by meeting the Doctor and realizing that maybe proving his ability to others is not the pinnacle of living as an adult with a complex disability. And this is the dark enlightenment at the end of the other path.
yeah, it's also I am not in any way placed to talk to the race aspect of this moment and Ryan as a character, because I am a very white guy. But it's certainly something I've seen referenced by other writers and commentators on this character and this moment in his arc, and it did stand out to me watching it. I was like, really, is this going to be the peak of Ryan's arc as a young black guy with dyspraxia? Is that he successfully throws a basketball adjacent object at some Cybermen? Is that the representation we were promised? Is this the pillar of hope? I don't like that from sort of any angle. And it's not like there's a world where that couldn't be a thing that is made to work. See my rough sketch for a point that this is just something that he's good at and cares about and is part of his identity, and this is an opportunity for him to just use it straightforwardly, heroically.
Yeah, it would be a bit of an obvious signifier, but I think it would be reasonably justified by coming from a genuine interest of the actor. But yeah, it just cloys with a general sense that if this were the 90s, he'd be riding a skateboard into action, you know?
Let's move into the ending from here. So this is literally the ending of Revolution of the Daleks, Ryan's last episode, and it returns to so much from where we began in The Woman Who Fell to Earth. So let's watch that.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. Go! Yes, go on, Ryan. You're doing it, son. Go on, son. Come on! Ryan, you okay, son?
Yeah.
Yeah? Yeah. Well, look, definitely further.
Yeah, maybe.
No, definitely.
I was looking online earlier. Some weird stuff going on in a village in Finland. troll invasion, so the locals are saying.
Yeah, I saw that. And you know there's a quarry in Korea that shut down because the workers are reporting they saw gravel creatures come to life.
Psychic paper.
These'll get us in anywhere.
Yeah, Finland, Korea.
Well, then what are we waiting for?
I'm not done here yet.
Yeah, but look, I mean, this... You'll be black and blue.
I don't know if you heard about me, but I'm Ryan Sinclair. Me and my mates, we saw off everything from giant spiders to a conscious universe. We fought Cybermen, Skithra, Morax, the mighty Bating. It's gonna take more than a bite to scare me off. Ain't that right, Grandad?
Yeah. Right then, well, come on in, jump on then.
Sun in my eyes.
Yeah, me too. Right. A few more tries, then we're going to save the world, eh?
Yeah.
Here we go. Get ready. 3, 2, 1, go! Go on, Ryan. Yeah. Go on, son. You're doing it, mate.
Yeah, so no praising BBC News article on how this was all worth it in the end.
Yeah, so a few specific notes to pull out, and this is I was sort of reading along the script with this one as well. So I find it sad that we come round from sort of what we were saying earlier about Ryan's grief and his sense that he needs to do this for Grace and that this is what Grace wants, and the pressure that grief puts on him. And how we land back at, to quote the script, Grace looks admiringly on. She smiles at them. There might even be the slightest nod of approval. Like, I know that that's a note for the actor, but there might even be the slightest nod of approval. Feels like slim pickings for Ryan after all this. The end of the day, Grace just really, really wants him to be able to ride a bike. He's trapped in a complicated emotional blood pact with a ghost about whether or not he can ride this bike down this hill. And that's it, really. As is sort of bookended by a later note. Pull away slowly as in the distance the small figures of Graham and Ryan keep going. Ryan cycles a little way, falls off, gets up. And so it goes.
We must imagine Ryan happy.
I know, right? Like, the thing about that is, and I think this is actually where the straightforward representation and the symbolic representation and my feelings about this as a story about a dyspraxic character start to diverge wildly. Like, they've diverged before, but this is really the point of no return. Because I have two completely opposed opinions here. One are that, like, I'm glad that he falls off the bike at the end. I think that was the right end for that scene, if this is going to be the end scene that there is. There is something very subtle about the timing that I find, like, I don't find funny, because it's not funny, but it's, like, comedic adjacent in its relationship to time. And I think there was no way to get around that. I think that's just how the beat lands, and it's just a bit awkward. But yeah, I think that's as right as it can be for what it is. I'm not happy about what it is, and I think this is where just long form failing to have an interest in how you creatively integrate representation into your story can accidentally land at you saying things that you don't intend to say in the more symbolic and sort of metaphorical realm, and how it can sort of drag you away from your underlying representative point working, Seaman's point about, there's no BBC article praising how wonderful this moment was, because it wasn't. And one of the reasons it wasn't is because there hasn't been an interest taken in what a story about a Doctor Who companion who has dyspraxia could be. Ryan is stuck going round in the same little circles that he's been since he was introduced. And I don't know, Chibnall might get some comfort in this relentless gravity of, I don't even want to call it realism, because I don't think it's realism in a sense that I think is actually limiting to the hyper reality of the human experience. It's realism at the expense of a bunch of actual reality. I think it also raises its head with Yaz. It's very, very present in the just bleak emptiness of the companion support circle. And it's very here, this sense that no, it was a toxic dream for Ryan to think that he deserved better than trying and failing to ride a little bike on a hill. And so it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is in the Chibnall era an elevation of powerlessness in several ways that is sort of, part of the complicated legacy of things that it inherits from absorbing the Davison era at a very, very formative age and sort of restaging the battles of the Davison era mindlessly and without the nuance present in the original flawed staging of those battles. And I like the Davison era, but this is certainly restaging some of its issues. But in general, the Chibnall era from many angles elevates, a sort of static powerlessness for its characters who never move anywhere, and for the Doctor who can't interfere and change history and has all of these stories that are ultimately, trying to recapture historicals as they were when the Doctor did less, affecting the story in a way that feels very, it can have its moments. Demons of the Punjab is great and is generally in this mould, but the overall trend is a bit claustrophobic. And I think that sensibility in Chibnall latches on to the factoid about dyspraxia, that it's not a condition that can be straightforwardly overcome, and goes, yes, that's the thing about it. That's how that fits into my worldview of the sort of profound cosmic necessity of stasis. And that's the message I'm going to drive home about it with, the overarching bookends of these scenes.
Yeah, which we've not got into this moment, because it doesn't directly relate to dyspraxia, but to talk a bit about sort of Ryan's confrontation with the Doctor before he ultimately decides to leave. There's an element of Ryan actually being the mouthpiece there for saying, no, the Doctor's an unhealthy habit. The Doctor misrepresents the idea of escape from problems. And the mature thing to do is to reject that. And I think that, there is a whole set of ideas in there that are very interesting, but they do ultimately come across quite relentless. And it feels sad to be where Ryan lands emotionally as a character, coming off some of the potential that we saw for his dynamic with the Doctor and with just, the universe. Back in The Woman That Fell to Earth.
Yeah, I'll say, Ryan genuinely remains my favourite character of the Chibnall era, in much the same way as Tegan remains my favourite character of the Davison era. I have similar big feelings about both as people who had a real chance to have an interesting dynamic with the Doctor, where the Doctor relates to an ordinary human being who is nonetheless like them in many ways, and who stumble through the show completely failing to ever have that connective experience with a Doctor who is much too busy with other things to engage with them in more than a fleeting way, and otherwise just treats them as generic companion. And ultimately leaves going, you know what, fuck this. And I don't even hate that. I think it's a much sadder iteration of the story than it could be to just have a story where the Doctor connects with these characters, which is what I desperately want. But I don't think it's wholly artistically invalid. It's just quite sad as a story to be telling. But I think what really irks me is this final scene, which, along with, obviously, the general wrapping up of Ryan's departure to be going off to be in a non-existent Big Finish box set, just robs any of that of any real dramatic potency, which, again, getting into the restaging of the Davison era without the strengths, at least Tegan's ending meant something. But yeah, I do also want to take a moment just to take cheap pot shots at the scene on a much less profound level and say the acting's really weird. Like, Tosin and Walsh both seem, or Bradley and Cole, both seem sort of awkwardly disinvested from this final scene in terms of performance, and I can't blame them. They come off like people awkwardly info-dumping in an advert for a new NHS phone line. They're talking like people who are just randomly dropping chunks of things for the audience to know into conversation in a way that is, par for the course for the Chibnall era in general, but they're just putting really the least effort into selling it that either of them ever do, and it really rings. And then that's all washed away with the blinding light of grace and that whole moment, which, it's the only reading of that gives it anything, isn't it?
Also, we're doing small pot shots. Specifically Ryan's line, me and my mates, we saw off everything from giant spiders to a conscious universe. I find deeply unintentionally funny because I really like the conflation here of really big spiders with a conscious universe. Like a cosmic event. The interaction with many people would be, reality changing, life changing. But, Ryan and his mates, they saw it off.
Get out of here!
We met a conscious universe and we're like, fuck off. Okay. And I just find that really funny and sort of weirdly surmising of the era's lack of sort of philosophical interest in itself. To be fair, actually, I should give this little speech points for Ryan reflecting on the concept of Ryan, a thing that I've said that there isn't enough of. And he notes that he is scared of things more substantial than bikes. So while he is still framing himself on a deeply, I want to say a bike-themed binary, but it's not even a binary. Like, it's a singularity of a spectrum. Like, the Ryan Sinclair bike scale of bike. But on that, he is. And to quote the actual, I won't say stage directions because more theatre than TV, but close in on Ryan. Iconic, heroic, strong. Killer smile. It's just nothing. It's not anything. Graham stands behind Ryan again, as Grace once did, supporting him, ready for the off again.
Victory for Graham, truly. He got everything that he wanted.
Yeah, do we have many or any other thoughts on Dyspraxia specific stuff in the ending, or do we feel concluded?
I would say you could keep putting pennies in me and I would be able to keep going for hours, but I do think that sums up the essence of most of my thoughts on the matter, I think.
Yep, agreed.
Then we've done it. That's it. We've looked at all the Ryan relevant stuff over the era.
Wow.
Okay, well that feels like the place to conclude our time here today. But of course these conversations don't conclude, they continue on. So thank you both of you for sharing your insights today. And thank you listeners. As always, let us know your thoughts as well on Ryan, representation, the specific topics and clips and discussions we went through today, where you approach this from. Feel free to comment or write in yourself too. Cheers.